Chapter 3740. On the other side, Lin Cece replied to Bai Shuali with a surprised expression. She knew that Yi Mubai had forgotten everything, but she really didn't expect that when Yuan's son was Yi Mubai's. Many years ago, Yi Mubai had slept with Yi Mulan's fiancé. Just thinking about it was exciting enough. The two girls chatted for a long time under the quilt. Gu Zhe came out of the bathroom and saw Lin Cece playing with her phone. Her pinky finger was missing. His heart ached for a moment, but he still smiled and went over. "Who are you talking to?" Lin Cece put down her phone and looked at him. "It's Shirley." Gu Zhe was only wearing a bathrobe. He leaned against the headboard and looked down at her. What did they say? Lin Cece and Gu Zhe had reconciled. She was no longer as cold as before and was acting coquettishly. She looked at him and bit her lower lip. "I said you can't be unhappy." Gu Zhe held her waist and smiled faintly. "It depends on what you're talking about." Lin Cece leaned into the crook of his arm and looked up at him. Then she moved her little face closer to his, her fingers gently caressing his lips. "It's about Mubai." Gu Zhe and Yi Mubai were rivals in love. Yi Mubai liked Lin Cece for a long time. At this moment, his little wife said that she was talking about Yi Mubai. President Gu snorted, picked up a cigarette, lit it, and took a puff. "Tell me about it." Lin Cece leaned into his arms and took away his cigarette. "You're not allowed to smoke." "What if I get pregnant?" She stroked her belly and looked at him. "Gu Zhe, I really want a child." Gu Zhe smiled. "You want children. You have to work hard." As he spoke, he was about to press her down again. Lin Cece hugged his neck and stopped him. "Let's talk business." In fact, Gu Zhe was just pretending, and then he just smiled and let it go. Lin Cece hugged him and said softly, "When Yuan's child is Yi Mubai's." "Shirley told me just now." Now when Yuan seems to have left B City. Old Bai is going crazy. Gu Zhe snorted. Feeling sorry for her. "I didn't." She hugged him and whispered, "Gu Zhe, we're going to get married. Can you stop being jealous?" He smiled faintly, hugged her, and kissed her again. His mood was complicated, but at the same time, it was soft. After so many years, she had turned back into the little fool she used to be. She was willing to let him love her again. While Gu Zhe and Lin Cece were in a good relationship, the Yi brothers were not as warm. Yi Mulan walked out, closed the door, and sat opposite Yi Mubai. Yi Mubai smoked fiercely and looked up. There was a hint of red in his eyes. "Can you tell me now? Is Xiangnan my son?" Yi Mulan also lit a cigarette. After taking a puff, he looked at Yi Mubai and smiled. "If he is, what will you do?" Yi Mubai stared at him. Yi Mulan sighed. "When Yuan has liked you for many years." "Mubai, I have something to tell you, because you are my brother." He said slowly, "Before you lost your memory, your relationship with Wen Yuan was just one of flesh and blood. You didn't promise her anything, and perhaps you didn't love her. Now, I think it's more or less the same. Wen Yuan probably left because he gave up. If that's the case, do you still want to get her back? Do you want to marry her or take back the custody of Xiangnan? Do you want to marry Lin Shuai and let Xiangnan have a stepmother?" Update tomorrow morning. Chapter 3741. Yi Mubai took a drag of his cigarette and looked up. "I won't marry Lin Shui." Yi Mulan smiled faintly and then looked at Yi Mubai. "Then are you going to marry Wen Yuan? How are you going to treat her after you marry her? Are you going to treat her with respect or be as cold as ice? Are you going to leave her in city be alone in New York or bring her to New York with you?" He paused. Mubai, if Wen Yuan is another Lin Shui, forget it. Let her go and let yourself go. He got up and patted Yi Mubai's shoulder. I don't want to repeat what happened many years ago. Yi Mubai clenched his fingers. Tell me her address. Even if it's not for Wen Yuan, Xiangnan is my son. I can't not see him in this life, right? You have to find out yourself. Wen Yuan didn't tell me either. Yi Mulin shook his head. Mubai, calm down and think about what to do next. Calm down. Yi Mubai couldn't calm down. Wen Yuan's departure and yesterday afternoon's intimacy seemed to have thrown a huge bomb into his heart. He had never felt that there was a woman as despicable as her. She ran away after sleeping with him, and they even had a son. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes and got up. Yi Mulin also got up, but as soon as he got up, Yi Mubai punched him. With a bang, Yi Mubai's body sank into the sofa again. He covered his nose and cursed, "Bastard, I've helped you raise your son for so long." Yi Mubai glared at him and slammed the door. At this time, Bai Shuali also ran out. Seeing her husband's nose bleeding, she immediately covered it with a tissue. Mubai, why are you like this? Yi Mulin looked at his wife's anxious look and squinted at her. Didn't you like him the most in the past? Now you know that men are violent. She said angrily, you can't even beat him. He was stunned and then smiled. When it came to her, she was always right. He did not care that his nose was bleeding. He reached out and hugged his little wife in his arms, wanting to continue being intimate. Bai Shuali naturally refused. She bit her lips and said, "You're bleeding." "It doesn't matter." Yi Mulin insisted on continuing. She pushed his shoulder and looked at him with a sad look. "No, I mean, it's dirty." Yi Mulin was stunned for a moment. He used a tissue to wipe the blood from his nose bit by bit. Then, he pounced on her like a tiger pouncing on a rabbit and pretended to bite her. "I will let you know what is dirty." Bai Shuali screamed in response. Her hands and feet were pressed down by him, and she struggled to crawl forward. She had always known what he liked. She climbed all the way to the master bedroom and was already teased by him. She gently drew on his chin with her little hand and bit her lip. "Are you really not going to ask about Mubai and Wen Yuan?" Yi Mulin's expression was somewhat complicated. After a long while, he spat out a few words, "It's not convenient." She laughed. "Yi Mulin, your period is here. What's inconvenient about it?" He lowered his head and bit her, not too hard, making her scream. His voice was heavy. "Let me check to see if it's inconvenient for you." As he said that, he forcefully wanted to check. Bai Shuali grabbed his hand and begged for mercy in a soft voice. No matter what she said, she couldn't stop him. "And you said that my period is here, huh?" He chuckled softly and nibbled on her little chin, enjoying her to his heart's content. Please remember the original domain name of this book. Jiutian Xinhuang Mobile Version Website. Chapter 3742. Yi Mubai went downstairs from the apartment. He sat in the car but didn't leave immediately. Instead, he smoked 2 cigarettes. Sitting in the car, he thought about a lot and straightened out everything from the time he saw Wen Yuan again. She was shocked when she saw him. Later, when he went to the villa, she deliberately seduced him. Did she plan to seduce him when he lost his memory and sleep with him as his sister-in-law? Why didn't she mention the past? Did she think that he would fall in love with her if he could start over again? Yi Mubai smoked and then smiled coldly. He started the car and asked his assistant to book the earliest flight to New York for him. 18 hours later, Yi Mubai was lying on a recliner in a hospital in central New York. He was undergoing hypnosis, trying to recover his past memories. In the darkness, he inserted Wen Yuan into his memory. In his deep sleep, the fragments of the past pieced together, and the scenes appeared in his mind one by one. Yimubai suddenly opened his eyes, his forehead and back covered in cold sweat. The doctor in front of him smiled. "Mr. Yi, it seems that you have recalled the past. The reason why you forgot before was because of the existence of resistance. Now that you understand, you remember. The existence of resistance, was it when Yuan?" Yimubai closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he had already made up his mind. He got up and put on his shoes. This time, his flight flew to H City. King had found Wen Yuan's whereabouts. Of course, it also cost Yimubai 20 million. King was simply the black market in the industry. When Yimubai appeared in front of Wen Yuan, it was almost 11 o'clock on Saturday night. He had booked a hotel, but he still went directly to her apartment. It was a nice apartment, more than 100 square meters. Her family background was good. Even if she divorced and moved out, Yi Mulan wouldn't treat her badly and she wouldn't feel wronged. Yimubai thought after seeing the furniture and decoration. Wen Yuan should be asleep. When he opened the door, he was wearing pajamas. He looked at him for a long time and then whispered, "Why are you here? Why else would you open the door dressed like this?" Yimubai squeezed in and stared at her with burning eyes. She was only wearing pajamas. Although it was pure cotton, it wasn't too thick. In Yimubai's eyes, it was the kind that attracted bees and butterflies. His gaze was unfriendly as he walked past her. Wen Yuan looked at him. After a long while, he finally pulled on his clothes and murmured, "What brings you here?" She remembered that they had made it clear that it was just an accident that day. She closed the door and turned her head to watch him walk to the sofa and sit down, so she also sat down. She lowered her voice to avoid waking up Xiangnan. "Yimubai, I've taken my medicine. Don't worry, I won't make trouble for you." He stared at her for a long time before saying softly, "Wen Yuan, I remember everything from the past." Her face was deathly pale. As for him, he looked at her face with admiration. Then, he said even more slowly, "Yi Xiangnan is my son, isn't he?" "No." Wen Yuan answered very quickly. She closed her eyes and bit her lips. "He isn't. Xiangnan. This name says it all." Yimubai reached out and pulled her closer. She fell into his arms in her pajamas. He was in a hurry and had been rushing back and forth. He hadn't shaved and hadn't showered for 2 days, but he was full of masculinity. She fell into his arms, smelling his scent and his body that was as hard as iron. All of this made her panic and scared. End of chapter. Chapter 37-43. Yimubai's eyes locked onto her, and his voice became softer. "If you say no, we can do a DNA test." Wen Yuan felt weak all over. She looked at the man in front of her, closed her eyes and murmured, "Yimubai, what do you want? Why don't you ask me what I want?" He stroked her face gently with his fingers. "Wen Yuan, actually, I want to ask you what you want. You've been trying so hard to get close to me. You gave birth to my child, but you didn't get anything. Don't you think it's a waste?" As he spoke, his finger moved to her lips suggestively. It had been like this in the past. He liked her body, liked making love with her, and enjoyed it, but he had never been able to really like her. He had always loved Lin Cece, not Wen Yuan. If he liked her even a little bit, he wouldn't be willing to hurt her like this. Wen Yuan slowly opened her eyes and looked into his eyes. "What do you want? Is it Xiangnan? Let's get married." Yimubai said quickly, but his tone was firm. "Since we have a son, let's get married. I'll take you and Xiangnan to the United States. It's better for Xiangnan." He's in H City, and it'll be just as good. Wen Yuan said quickly, and then she struggled away. She retreated a step away from him, but when he reached out, she was in his arms again. Yimubai frowned and stared at Wen Yuan. You want Xiangnan to be a single-parent child? I'll get married again. Wen Yuan looked down and said in a low voice, I won't be single forever, Yimubai. We've missed each other in our lives. Without Xiangnan, we're already two unrelated people. Really? He sneered and lifted her chin. Then why did you tempt me to sleep with you that day? Wen Yuan, don't say that you didn't mean it. You're a woman. Don't you know what it means to a man when you dress like that? His fingers gently pinched her chin. And we've slept together many times. I think you know what kind of style I like best, don't you? No. No. Wen Yuan desperately shook her head, but her face was in his hand and she couldn't break free. Tonight, Yimubai was frightening. He stared into her eyes. No. Do you dare to say that you don't feel anything sitting on my lap? His large palm was holding her, separated only by a thin layer of fabric, which made her feel ashamed and resentful. She couldn't stand him treating her like that. She lay there and cried softly, Yimubai, let go of me, bastard. He withdrew his hand, still staring at her. You're the bastard if you're not satisfied, aren't you? In the past, you were so proactive and went to my place again and again. Didn't you want me to satisfy you? Didn't you just want to sleep with me? Why have you become so reserved after getting married once? He was very domineering. He directly put her down on the sofa and looked down at her eyes. Look at you. You're clearly the same as before. Stop talking. Wen Yuan bit her lips and turned her face to the side with a red nose. Yimubai, I'm not what you think I am. Let's end it. If you didn't want to sleep with me that day, I would really think that you've turned over a new leaf. But obviously, you're not. Before you ran away, you even wanted to use me to satisfy you. He gently bit her lips. Why? You haven't had a man all these years. Is there no one who can satisfy you? Try to update 3 more chapters at night. I'm always sleepy. End of this chapter. Chapter 3744. Actually, he admitted that he was a little uncomfortable. This woman had given birth to his child, but she had been married to his brother for a few years, when Yuan couldn't take it anymore. Her eyes were watery. Yimubai, you bastard. Leave. I don't want you here. You don't want me. His eyes were cold. If you don't want me, you chased after me every day and climbed into my bed when I was drunk. Wen Yuan, have you forgotten that you used my big brother to get close to me? Have you forgotten how you used the identity of my sister-in-law to seduce me? His fingers treated her mercilessly, and his voice was hoarse. Look at yourself. Do you want to see what you look like now? You said you don't want me, but Wen Yuan, your body doesn't show that. She was treated so badly by him that she almost couldn't speak. Yimubai, let me go. I don't want to be like this. He treated her mercilessly, and there was no expression on his face. Suddenly, he smiled. Wen Yuan, you've always been the one who won't let me go. She was stunned. He let go of her, sat on the other side, lit a cigarette and took a puff. Wen Yuan sat up awkwardly and pulled up her clothes. She wanted to escape, but he said slowly, if you dare to leave, I'll do it in front of Yi Xiangnan. You won't be able to escape for the rest of your life. Her face was deathly pale. Are you afraid? Yimubai held the cigarette and rubbed his forehead with his thumb. Wen Yuan, why didn't you think about this day when you seduced a man? You thought you could escape after sleeping with me, didn't you? She sat there in a daze and murmured, how did you know? He stared at her eyes and smiled. There were many wonderful scenes of us in the past that were captured by the paparazzi. My brother spent a lot of money to buy them. Wen Yuan didn't say anything else. She just sat there in a daze. Yi Mubai smoked. After a long time, he looked up at her. Go to New York with me. Xiangnan needs a normal family. Wen Yuan looked at him in a daze again. Do you want me to say that I love you? Yi Mubai frowned. Wen Yuan, don't be too greedy. Wen Yuan blinked gently. Is it greedy to ask your husband to love you? Her hands were placed on her lap, just like a primary school student. In fact, she was always at a loss in front of him, always in a weak position. She looked at the man in front of her absent-mindedly and smiled sadly. Yi Mubai, I give up. Really, you must not have heard when I started to chase after you. Since you acted in your first movie, I've watched every poster of you and every movie of yours many times. It's not an exaggeration to say that I'm a fanatic fan. As she said that, she paused and licked her lips. But at the same time, I'm the eldest daughter of the Wen family. I can't chase after you all day like those little fans. Our families are well matched, and I can't chase after you all day like Bai Shuali. My upbringing doesn't allow me to do that. I used to envy Bai Shuali, and I also thought that you would end up with her, but you didn't. You fell in love with Lin Cece just when I wanted to confess to you. Wen Yuan looked a bit dazed. At that time, I thought that we weren't young anymore, and you hadn't had a girlfriend. Maybe you would be willing to settle down, and I knew that I was very suitable to be a wife. I even thought that if you had something with other women after marriage, I would be able to tolerate it. But now I feel that that kind of feeling is the feeling of a fan towards an idol, not the feeling that a wife should have towards her husband. Yi Mubai, after all that I've been through, I finally said to myself that I don't want the passion that you've given me. I want to start my own life again, even if you threaten me with Xiangnan. He was still frowning. Wen Yuan, I won't have any messy women after marriage. He wasn't so bad that he wouldn't mess around after marriage. Wen Yuan raised his eyes and looked at him. Tell me that you love me. Even if it was a lie, she was willing to believe it. However, Yi Mubai didn't say it. He was unwilling and disdainful to lie to a woman. He really didn't fall in love with her. He had never tried to understand her. All his love had indeed fallen on the girl named Lin Cece. Even now, he still had feelings for her. And Lin Shui, whom he had chosen before, looked a bit like Lin Cece, but he didn't have feelings for her, nor did he have any feelings for her. Wen Yuan had a child, which also made him have feelings for her, so he didn't have to think about it. He was willing to marry Wen Yuan. However, other than this, there was nothing else. He was a practical man. He didn't know if he would love her in the future, but if they got married, he would use her body a lot. The few times that afternoon made him understand why they couldn't break up in the past, and why they would always roll into bed after breaking up. Their bodies were too compatible. She was the kind of lady who looked gentle on the surface, but when it came to bed, men couldn't control themselves. Wen Yuan had a seductive body. Even though he was very angry at her now, he still wanted her. Wen Yuan's body was seductive, but he still wanted her. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. Other than love, I can give you anything. But other than this, I don't want anything else. Wen Yuan said stubbornly. Yi Mubai stared at her. Wen Yuan, are you childish enough? Everything between us, including Xiangnan's birth, was initiated by you. Now you don't want to be responsible for his life, do you? Wen Yuan grabbed his hair. There's no problem with Xiangnan's personality. He's very smart. He won't ask me to accept a marriage that I don't want. You can rest assured. I can rest assured. He sneered. When I didn't know, I had a son. When you on, you're retreating in order to advance. What tricks do you want to play? She turned her face to the side in embarrassment and closed her eyes. I didn't. If you don't believe me, we can sign an agreement. I won't use Xiangnan to threaten you. You can marry Lin Shui. He stared at her. When you on, say it again. Chapter 37:45. After she finished speaking, he stared at her and asked her with a cold voice, I'll ask you again. Either you get married, or I'll take Yi Xiangnan away. He'll have a better future if he follows me. Wen Yuan's entire body was trembling. You can give him a future, but can you give him love? He looked into her eyes and suddenly realized a fact. Yi Mubai moved closer to her face and pressed his thin lips against hers. Wen Yuan, do you hate me? Her lips were tightly pursed, and she didn't make a sound. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. Because I don't love you, so you hate me. His fingers gently caressed her face. When we first started, I said that there was only sex and no love between us. It was impossible for us to get married. But when Yuan, tell me, how did we get a child? His hand gently touched her neck and slid down her veins, as if he could break her neck with a single force. When Yuan closed his eyes. This is the last time. You didn't use any protection. Why didn't you take the medicine? He stared at her with a burning gaze, not letting go of any of her expressions. When Yuan smiled miserably. Yi Mubai, if you don't want this child, you can leave now. Really? I'll give up, okay? I won't pester you anymore, I won't seduce you anymore, and I won't appear in front of you anymore. She smiled and cried. Yi Mubai, really, you can pretend that it never happened. You can still go back to America and be your director. I won't look for you again. Even if I might marry Lin Shui. He looked into her eyes and said in a heavy tone, Wen Yuan, have you thought it through? Her face was covered in tears, but she still said, yes, I've thought it through. She wasn't a child anymore. Before she left, she had thought it through clearly. She wanted to start over. Xiangnan was also a very smart child. He would make her happy, and they would all make her happy. In the past, without Yi Mubai, they were fine, and they would be fine in the future. Yi Mubai looked at her for a long time and suddenly smiled. Wen Yuan, if you think it through, don't change your mind. Don't show up in front of me one day and tell me that you're pregnant with my child again. Damn it, you better figure out whether you have my child in your stomach now. I've taken my medicine. Her voice was a little flustered. Her eyes were filled with tears and she felt a little humiliated. Perhaps, in Wen Yuan's life, she had always been happy. She was the eldest daughter of the Wen family, and later on, she married Yi Mulin. No one had ever looked down on her. She was honorable, but in front of Yi Mubai, she would always be a tiny fan. Wen Yuan was a mature woman, but in front of Yi Mubai, she was always like a young girl, full of emotions. Now, everything was over. She didn't want to be that young girl anymore, because she had Xiangnan. She couldn't let Xiangnan suffer for her own feelings. Yi Mubai didn't love her. She didn't want Xiangnan to see his parents not loving each other. This kind of family wasn't good for Xiangnan. When the child grew up, he would understand. When Yuan wholeheartedly wanted him to leave, wanted him to give up, and he didn't believe her. She closed her eyes. I have ordinary cold medicine and anti-inflammatory medicine here. If you're worried, she stood up and took out a box of medicine from the small drawer. She poured out 4 or 5 pills and stuffed them into her mouth. She picked up a glass of water and drank half of it before swallowing all the medicine. Yi Mubai's expression was ugly. End of this chapter. Chapter 37-46. When Yuan's face was even worse than his, and it was also very pale. She said softly, "You can rest assured now. Even if I have a child, I can't give birth to it." After saying that, the cup between her fingers fell on the coffee table, and the water splashed everywhere. However, she seemed to be unaware of it. She just looked at him and smiled faintly. It was as if she was mocking him, and also mocking herself. Yimubai just looked at her, and kept looking at her. After a long time, he said, "It's good that you've thought it through." He stood up and said indifferently, "I will pay the child support fee, and I will also ask to visit him from time to time. He is my son, and there is no reason for you to monopolize him." Then he lowered his eyes. "I will ask the lawyer to come over tomorrow, if you haven't changed your mind." When Yuan looked down and didn't say anything, Yimubai stared at her for a long time. She thought he would leave, but he didn't. Instead, he took off his coat, threw it aside, and walked straight to the children's room. When Yuan came back to her senses and stopped him, her face was very ugly, and she bit her lip. "What do you want to do?" "I'll sleep with Xiangnan. Otherwise, do you think I should sleep with you, Miss Wen?" His voice was also very cold, and it was a little mocking. When Yuan bit her lower lip. "Can you sleep on the sofa, or I'll sleep on the sofa in the master bedroom? There are no extra rooms here." She knew that if he really fought with her, she had no chance of winning. After she said that, Yimubai frowned. Suddenly, he came over, grabbed her body, and walked to her bedroom. When Yuan was scared, he took her away, closed the door, raised his hand, and took off his shirt. He took her to the soft bed. It was a little comfortable, and her breath was everywhere. He fell on the bed with her. He didn't do anything, although he had the intention. But basically, Yimubai was also a man with principles. He just trapped her and said in a deep voice, "If you still think it's not good to get married after this night, I will ask the lawyer to come over tomorrow morning." He had been running back and forth for a few days, and he was also tired, so he decided to sleep after saying that. He didn't even take a shower. After when Yuan was held in his arms, her nose was filled with his breath. In fact, she knew what he meant in her heart. He was telling her that a marriage without love and only sex was not so unbearable. However, she couldn't get over herself. She didn't want to chase after a man who didn't love her. When Yuan closed her eyes, she wanted to ignore this feeling, but she couldn't. She didn't want to cry, but she did. The one who was hugging her was not just a man. He was not just Xiangnan's father. He was her entire youth. She closed her eyes, turned around, and hooked her arms around his neck. Yimubai closed his eyes, but the corners of his mouth were slightly raised. He put his hands around her waist and leaned forward to kiss her. When Yuan lowered her head and didn't let him kiss her, she just buried her face in his chest and quietly felt his warmth. Yimubai lowered his head and looked at her. He didn't force her. He was too tired, and he fell asleep just like that. Or maybe, he didn't love her. If he had coaxed her that night, if he had insisted on accompanying her, maybe they wouldn't have been separated like this. Maybe when Yuan wouldn't have given up. They had shared countless times, and they had a child. But in such a quiet night, they were still like strangers. She didn't feel warmth in his arms. He kissed her just now because of Yuan. Updated tomorrow at noon. Chapter 37-47. When Yuan stayed quiet until dawn. She didn't even close her eyes, because she was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would be vulnerable again and sink into depravity again. Just like that, it was dawn, and the morning light shone through the white curtains. Her eyes were a little sore and a little bitter. She gently blinked in his arms. Yimubai was still hugging her from behind. She gently struggled to get up, but when she was getting dressed, she couldn't help but turn her head to look at him. He was very good-looking. Even though he was in his 30s, he still had the most perfect appearance, and his body was well-maintained. When Yuan looked at him silently for a long time, then pushed the door open and went out. She made breakfast and then woke up Xiangnan. Xiangnan had already signed up for school and had to be at school before 8 o'clock. She woke her son up, took care of his clothes and food, and then sent him to kindergarten. She also asked for leave from school. After everything was done, she returned to the apartment. Yimubai was already up. He was wearing denim trousers, and his upper body was bare, revealing his muscular body. When he saw her come back, he frowned. "Where's Xiangnan?" When Yuan slowly closed the door and then looked down. "I signed him up for kindergarten. He's been at school for 2 days." She paused, as if she was afraid that he would object. "He's very obedient, and he's doing very well in school." Yimubai looked at her and then frowned. "Do you have any men's shirts here?" After asking, he also felt that it was a waste of time. How could she have any? When Yuan knew that he didn't like the smell of his shirt, so she said softly, "I'll wash it for you and dry it." When she said it, it was natural, and she didn't think much about it and went to the room. He grabbed her hand, still frowning. "What is this?" When Yuan stopped in his tracks and lowered his eyes. "Or I can help you buy it." "No need." His voice was indifferent, and then he let go of her. When Yuan went to the bedroom, took his shirt, washed it by hand, and then dried it. Yimubai leaned against the door of the bathroom and looked at her, watching her submissive appearance. When Yuan was very good-looking. His eyebrows and eyes were the type that would suit a home, especially his side profile, which was very good-looking. She was very focused when she was doing something, and he kept staring at her. After a long time, his voice was indifferent. "When Yuan, what's your decision?" She lowered her eyes, her long eyelashes fluttering. She turned back to glance at him before lowering her eyes again, her voice very soft. "I want to live in H City." He crossed his arms in front of him and looked at her quietly. "You mean, you want to take care of Xiangnan alone?" "Yes." She pursed her lips. "I want to be alone." She spoke again, "Life in America is not suitable for me." He walked in and hooked his arm around her waist from behind. His strength was a little rough. He turned her around and pinched her chin with his other hand. His eyes searched for any changes in her expression. "Then why did you go to the United States before?" She didn't know what to do under his grip. She licked her lips. "That was then, and now is now, Yimubai. My feelings then and now are different." At that time, she still had feelings for him, but ever since that time in the hospital, she felt that it was impossible for them to be together again. She didn't want to be that humble anymore. "Is that so?" He narrowed his eyes. "It's good that you've decided." After that, he didn't talk to her anymore. He let her go and walked to the balcony of the bedroom to smoke. This book came from Chapter 3748. When Yuan continued to dry his clothes. She just turned her head and glanced at his back. Sexy and tall. She didn't dare to look at him anymore and turned her head back in a panic. His proposal was actually a tempting poison to her. She used to be unable to resist it. When Yuan silently tried to ignore the impact of his body on her, and she didn't want to think about the things they used to have. Yimubai turned around while smoking and leaned against the window to watch her. She was well dressed, and only he knew how much her body made men want to vomit blood when she took off her clothes. His eyes swept over her. After a long time, she took out a shirt and walked towards him. Okay, you can change. Yimubai took the shirt with a cigarette in one hand and looked at her deeply. Wen Yuan habitually looked down and was about to leave when he grabbed her hand. This is the last time I'm asking you. His voice sounded a little low in the quiet space. I have a career in New York. I can't appear in front of you again and again. I have my own life and I won't change myself for a woman. Accepting you and Xiangnan is my biggest concession. If you want me to stay in H City with you, don't even think about it. Wen Yuan gently broke away from his hand. I didn't think that way. She looked up at him bravely. I don't dare to think that you'll give up anything for me or Xiangnan. Yimubai, Xiangnan was just an accident. You don't have to take it to heart. I can sign the agreement if you want, but I don't want your money. If you don't want my money, why do you want Yimulin's? His gaze was a little threatening. Wen Yuan bit her lip and looked down. After a long time, she smiled. For me, he's my family, and you, really, actually have nothing to do with him. She took a deep breath. It's just a dream that I pursued when I was young. When you were young. Yimubai sneered. Wen Yuan, you followed me when you were 30 and begged me to sleep with you. Have you forgotten? Her face was pale. She looked away. Don't say it anymore, why not? Is it because you can't bear to look back? He let go of her with a sneer and put on his shirt. Then he dialed a number and asked his assistant to call a lawyer. In less than an hour, the lawyer came and the agreement was magically printed. Wen Yuan and Yimubai sat on two sofas in the small study. Yimubai looked at it for a while and then gave it to Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan reached out and took it. In fact, the agreement was very simple. It wasn't as complicated as that of divorced couples. It was mainly focused on Xiangnan's custody and visitation. It was written that if she remarried, Xiangnan's custody would be given to him. If Yi Xiannan stayed with him, he would pay her 20 million every year until Yi Xiannan turned 18. Yi. And at. Yi got at Yi. At when? Yi. Do you want to file a lawsuit now? He stared at her. Make a big fuss. Tell people that the child is not my brother's, but that you slept with me. When Yuan's face was even worse. Her lips were trembling. After a long time, she said softly, Yimubai, you are too shameless. Update at night, this book came from. Chapter 3749. Are you shameless? He grabbed her wrist and raised it high. Who was the one who got pregnant with my child and played me like a fool? Wen Yuan, if you hadn't slept with me in the end, perhaps we wouldn't be like this now. But when you left, you still wanted to sleep with me, and then you told me that you had no feelings for me, that I was just a dream and that there was no meaning to it. Don't you think that you are very selfish? He didn't even know what he was saying anymore. He was just angry. Later on, when Yimubai thought about the day and night, he realized that he was so angry because he liked Wen Yuan. He was angry because she had given up on him. Just when he fell in love with her, she had given up on him. But at this moment, he only felt that she was despicable, even speaking without thinking in front of the lawyer. Wen Yuan's face was very ugly and very pale. She sat there and stared at him blankly. It was as if she didn't know him. There was an indescribable hurt in her eyes. At this moment, Wen Yuan was extremely fragile. She didn't even know why she was so disgusted by him. Everything she did was wrong and he hated her. In his heart, she was a very, very scheming woman. Since that was the case, why did he still marry her? Wasn't it better to find someone he liked? Wen Yuan hugged herself. She wasn't a weak person, but at this moment, she was hurt by him. She hugged herself and lowered her eyes, not looking at him anymore. Then, she said softly, Yimubai, I agree. After saying that, she was a little dazed. She knew that her decision was destined to be lonely for the rest of her life. Other than Xiangnan, she would have nothing. She would never have feelings or a man again. But she felt that for Xiangnan, she was willing to sign this. Where do I sign? Her voice was a little shaky, and she had been trying hard to control herself. The lawyer was very uncomfortable at the side. It wasn't going to be easy to earn money today. He took the document over and pointed to a place for Wen Yuan to sign. Wen Yuan didn't even look at it and quickly signed. She used a lot of force, and the strength of the pen seeped into the paper, leaving a heavy mark there. After signing, she stared at it blankly, then looked up at Yimubai. I hope you won't regret it, he said to her. After he finished speaking, he walked out. When Yuan's calm voice came from behind him, I won't. Is that so? He stopped, turned his head, and gave her a mocking smile. Yimubai left, and so did the lawyer. When Yuan sat alone in the living room. The entire world was silent. She was wrong from the beginning. She wouldn't regret it, because she had to grow up and pay for her mistakes. Even if she was Wen Yuan, she was. She thought that he would go back to America or be city directly, but when she went to pick up Xiangnan from kindergarten in the afternoon, the teacher said that Xiangnan had been picked up by his father. Wen Yuan's mind was in a mess. When she picked up her phone and dialed his number, she felt weak all over. The call went through, and Yimubai's voice was very cold. I'm picking up Xiangnan for lunch, and I'll send him back around 8:00. He added, don't worry, Miss Wen. I'm very contractual. When Yuan held the phone and felt that his voice seemed to be coming from a very far place. When he opened his mouth, his voice was extremely hoarse. Thank you. End of this chapter. Chapter 3750. You don't need to thank me. I'm Xiangnan's father. Yimubai said coldly, even if I want to give him a complete family. The phone in Wen Yuan's hand slipped. When she came back to her senses and picked it up, her face was already full of tears. She didn't know what was wrong with her. She just felt very uncomfortable. If there was anything in her life that she regretted the most, it would be the seduction that afternoon. She shouldn't have slept with him for the last time just to say goodbye. She didn't understand why he would have such a big reaction to sex in the past. Was it because of Xiangnan's existence? She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand anymore. To understand a person meant that she wouldn't give up. And she really wanted to give up on him. On the other side, Yimubai hung up the phone. He held the steering wheel with both hands and focused on driving. Yi Xiangnan sat in the back seat and looked at him with a cautious and defensive expression. Yimubai thought that this child didn't look at him like this before. Xiangnan used to like him very much and always called him uncle. But now, was he unhappy because he called him father? Yimubai parked the car in front of a children's restaurant and took him to eat his favorite fried chicken. Although it was not nutritious, it was okay to eat it occasionally to make the child happy. After ordering, a lot of delicious food was piled up in front of Xiangnan, but Yi Xiangnan was not interested. He drank his drink and looked at Yimubai. Uncle, when will you take me home? Yimubai felt a pain in his heart. He reached out and rubbed the little guy's head. Xiangnan, didn't I tell you that I'm a father, not an uncle? He didn't expect him to understand, but Xiangnan nodded. I know. Yimubai frowned. Did Mom tell you that? At home, I used to call Dad uncle, so uncle is Dad. The little guy was only 3 years old, but he was able to explain such a complicated relationship so clearly. Yimubai was stunned for a moment. Then, he thought that this child was quite smart, just like Byanin. He had inherited the intelligence of the Yi family. He had mixed feelings. After all, he was his own child. It would be a lie to say that he did not like him. Moreover, Xiangnan was so adorable. He could not bear to part with him, but it would be too cruel for him and Wen Yuan to go to court and snatch Xiangnan away. He wanted to marry Wen Yuan for Xiangnan, but that woman did not agree. Therefore, he and Wen Yuan had no other relationship except for the fact that they shared a son. No matter how tempting her body was, there was no need for him to sleep with such a stupid woman. Yes, stupid. Yimubai ruffled his son's hair and said gently, "After you finish eating, Daddy will take you to buy some gifts and then send you to Mommy's place." As he spoke, his voice was a little hoarse. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against Xiangnan's. "You will still live with Mommy in the future, but if you miss Daddy, you can call me, and Daddy will appear, okay?" Xiangnan stared at him in a daze. Yimubai felt a little sad in his heart. He smiled gently and said, "In the future, you have to call me Daddy." He was just angry before, but now facing Xiangnan, he was even more angry at that cruel woman. For the so-called dream and self-esteem, she let Xiangnan grow up in a single-parent family. Wen Yuan was the most unreasonable woman he had ever met. He really wanted to strangle her to death. End of this chapter. Chapter 3751. Xiangnan looked at him. After a while, he lowered his head and said, "Okay," dejectedly. Then, he leaned on him again. He looked so pitiful that he couldn't even enjoy his meal. Yimubai reached out and touched his little head. His heart ached a little. Perhaps, at this moment, he hated Wen Yuan the most. Xiangnan didn't enjoy his meal. After a while, he looked at Yimubai. "Daddy, do you want to eat?" "Daddy isn't hungry." Yimubai's voice was indifferent. Xiangnan responded with an "oh," and became even more dejected. After a while, he handed over a drumstick. Without saying anything, he gave it to Yimubai. Yimubai looked at him, then silently took it and took a bite. Yi Xiangnan chuckled softly. At that moment, Yimubai loved Xiangnan very much, but he also felt a little guilty. It was an indescribable feeling. Later, he took Xiangnan to the amusement park to play for 2 hours. Then, he went to buy gifts. From toys to clothes and shoes, the whole trunk was piled up. On the way, Wen Yuan called. Yimubai raised his hand to look at the time. It was already past 8 o'clock. He picked up the phone. "I'll send him back in a while." She didn't say anything. He couldn't help but mock her again. "Don't worry, I'm not a person who goes back on his word." He thought that she wouldn't say anything. Unexpectedly, Wen Yuan still said, "Yimubai, actually, there's no reason for you to hate me." "Then why do you hate me? Is there a reason?" "From start to finish, we were just a man and a woman." His voice was low and cold. It was because he missed Nan and fell asleep that he spoke to her like this. Wen Yuan was embarrassed and directly hung up the phone. Yimubai pursed his lips and also hung up the phone. When driving back, he looked at the rearview mirror from time to time and looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan slept soundly. After all, he was a 3-year-old child. He was tired after playing for a whole day. The car arrived at her apartment building. Wen Yuan was waiting downstairs. He stopped the car, opened the back seat door, and carried Xiangnan to her. He took Xiangnan's gift and followed her upstairs. Wen Yuan was a little uneasy. After arriving at the apartment, she put Xiangnan down and asked softly, "You're leaving tomorrow?" When Yuan didn't know what to say, so he could only say, "I'll see you off." He stood there without moving. As soon as she walked away, she pressed herself against his chest, as if throwing herself into his embrace. Yi Mubai stared at her. "Miss Wen, what tricks are you playing now?" When she fell into his arms, she was so dizzy that she could not get up in time, and he thought that she had seduced him. Slowly standing up, she did not explain to herself, because there was no need. He had already determined that she was seducing him. Yi Mubai stared at her for a long time before saying in a hoarse voice, "I'm leaving. There's a film to be shot. It might be 4 months after it's done. I'll call Xiangnan." She nodded lightly, not saying anything. Yi Mubai wanted to say something, but he felt that there was no need. At this moment, he also realized that she was wearing a very conservative set of home clothes, and she was very tightly wrapped up. He couldn't help but sneer. In the future, he would not sleep with her, even if she took off all her clothes. He left without any reluctance to leave. He just went to Xiangnan's room, kissed the little boy, and covered him with the quilt. Yi Mubai had never been a father, but he wasn't young anymore. He knew how to love and care for a child. Perhaps he would reject a scheming woman, but he wouldn't reject a gentle child like Xiangnan. This was his flesh and blood. He didn't need a DNA test to be sure. When Yuan stood at the door, looking at him quietly. When he looked up, his eyes met hers. After a long time, he said softly, "When Yuan, you think you're great, but in fact, you're very selfish. You're very cruel to Xiangnan." With that, he walked past her. And when Yuan stood in the corridor, his whole body cold. In the end, Yi Mubai still left. On such a lonely night. When Yuan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking into the distance. The plane took off at the airport. Did he leave? Later, she heard that he broke up with Lin Xuanyi. Later, there was a rumor that he had an affair with a Chinese star in the United States. That girl was a newcomer, the female lead of his film. After the filming of his film was completed, the photo of the girl sitting on his lap at the celebration party was published on the front page of all the major magazines. That young female star with a bright future openly said that Yi Mubai was everything she imagined a man to be. When Yuan was far away. Occasionally, she would see news of him. She just watched quietly. In their world, there was no intersection except for Xiangnan. He would call once or twice a week and talk to Xiangnan for about half an hour. Since Nan was talking in his room, when Mian wouldn't be there to listen, Yi Mubai never came back. It was not until the spring festival that when Yuan heard from Bai Shuali that Yi Mubai was coming back, and he might even bring a girlfriend back. Was it that female star, Lin Danny? When Yuan stood by the window, looking at the fine snow outside quietly, after a long time, she chuckled softly, somewhat mockingly. Her phone rang. She walked over to pick it up. It was a call from Xiangnan's teacher. He sounded very anxious. "Miss Wen, Yi Xiangnan is not feeling well. He has been sent to the hospital. Please hurry over. It's the hematology department of XX Hospital." Chapter 3752. After when Yuan went to the hospital, everything was blurry. She could only hear the doctor's voice, "The child needs further examination. We can't rule out a rare chronic disease." When Yuan's legs were a little weak. After a while, she looked up and asked, "Is there a good treatment plan?" The doctor shook his head gently. "At present, in addition to bone marrow matching, we can use the umbilical cord blood of newborn babies of the same father and mother. We suggest using the second plan. After all, the rejection rate is low, and the recurrence rate is low. In addition, the child will suffer less. Moreover, the first plan is not easy to find a match. Perhaps the family members and the bone marrow banks of the world can't find a suitable match. Then, we have to use the second plan. You, think about it carefully. Although it is a chronic disease, the earlier it is treated, the better. After the doctor finished speaking, he signed a piece of paper given by the nurse and left. When Yuan stood there alone for a long time. She was a little helpless. At this moment, she was desperate. Xiangnan was her everything. She couldn't live without Xiangnan. Yimubai once said that she was selfish. For her own sake, she didn't care about Xiangnan's feelings. It seemed that she was a selfish person who only cared about her own feelings. If she had agreed to Yimubai's proposal, would Xiangnan be lying alone in the hospital today? When Yuan walked to the door of the sterile room, Xiangnan had to be isolated for 3 days and treated with ultraviolet rays. His small body lay there quietly, his face a little pale. How could her Xiangnan get such a disease? He had always been so healthy and lively. The doctor's words came back to her mind, he had pneumonia a while ago. In fact, it was a manifestation of this disease. It was just that we neglected it at the time and didn't check it out. When Yuan's face was pressed against the cold glass, she closed her eyes gently and felt very guilty. It was her who neglected Xiangnan because of the appearance of Yimubai. If she had paid more attention and cared more about Xiangnan, it wouldn't have taken so long to find out. She felt guilty and her heart was being cut by a knife. Her tears were stained with the cold glass. Only she could understand the feeling of her heart being cut by a knife. Xiangnan needed to be isolated for 3 days. She only went in for a short period of time the next morning. Xiangnan woke up. He looked at her weakly and called her mother, "Am I seriously ill? Mom, am I going to die?" When Yuan clenched her hand and kissed him, "No, you won't." Xiangnan's eyes weren't as bright as before, but he tried to raise his hand to comfort his mother. "Mom, Xiangnan isn't afraid of pain. I want to live to be with you." That small head was pressed against her neck. When Yuan's sadness reached its peak. As a mother, Xiangnan's mother, she couldn't care less about her pride and everything else. She lowered her head and kissed Xiangnan. "Good girl, everything will be fine." Thinking of Nan, he fell asleep in this short period of time. When Yuan reached out and gently caressed his face, she said in a low voice, "Xiangnan, Mommy won't let anything happen to you." The nurse reminded her that it was time for her to go out. When Yuan walked out and watched quietly for a long time, she called Yimubai in the corridor. It rang for a long time before the call was picked up. It was a girl's voice, "Director Yi is taking a shower." Director Yi. It must be one of his artists. The voice was young. It could be Lin Danny. When Yuan was embarrassed, she said softly, "Wait for him." "Okay, can you ask him to call me?" "I'm Wen Yuan." The girl was polite. She said that she would pass the message and hung up soon. When Yuan kept waiting for Yimubai's call. He didn't call, and she stood at the window in the hallway and continued to wait. She kept waiting, he was taking a shower. There was a woman beside him. When Yuan knew what was happening, she closed her eyes. She was confused about having a child with a man like this. She also felt disgusted. But she had no choice. She stood there, her eyes a little wet. She waited for a long time. It was about an hour or 2. When Yuan's heart was almost numb. Chapter 3753. When her heart was numb, Yimubai called. His voice was cold. What's the matter? Wen Yuan held the phone and moved her lips, but she couldn't make a sound for a long time. Her senses seemed to be numb. After a long time, she found her voice again. Her voice was unbelievably hoarse. Yimubai, Xiangnan is sick. On the other end of the phone, the breath seemed to freeze. Yimubai clenched the phone and said after a while, "How is Xiangnan?" "Very bad." Wen Yuan sniffed and said in a low voice, "Can you go back to H City?" "I know. I'm disturbing you." Yimubai was silent for a few seconds. It was like a whole night of torture for Wen Yuan. After a long time, he finally said, "Xiangnan is also my son." He paused for a few more seconds. "I'll be in H City tomorrow morning." The phone in Wen Yuan's hand slipped down. She was at a loss. She suddenly covered her face and almost burst into tears. Yimubai flew to H City at 4:00 in the morning. When he appeared at the hospital, Wen Yuan wasn't asleep. She was sitting on the bench in the aisle. She hadn't slept for almost 36 hours. Her face was a little haggard and frighteningly pale. He slowly walked to her. The light at the top of the aisle made his shadow very long, blocking half of Wen Yuan's face. Wen Yuan suddenly raised her eyes and looked straight at him. Yimubai slowly sat down next to her and lit a cigarette. It wasn't until now that he asked about Xiangnan's condition. "What's wrong with Xiangnan?" He knew in his heart that it was a serious illness. Otherwise, with Wen Yuan's awkward personality, she wouldn't have taken the initiative to ask him to come back. Wen Yuan put her hands on her knees and lowered her eyes. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "It's a blood disease. A bone marrow transplant or another child." Yimubai listened but didn't say anything. He leaned his tall body against the back of the chair and blew out a smoke ring. In the gray smoke, she couldn't see his expression clearly. She didn't know what he was thinking, so she didn't dare to ask. After smoking a cigarette, he went to the door of the sterile room and quietly looked at Xiangnan. Until dawn. At dawn, the doctor came over. He talked to the doctor alone for a while, and Wen Yuan waited at the door of the office. In just one day and 2 nights, the radiance on her face seemed to have disappeared. When Yimubai came out, his expression was somewhat solemn. His gaze was somewhat deep as he looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan pursed his lips and asked softly, "What did the doctor say?" Yimubai ignored her and took a few steps forward. Then, he paused. He turned his head and stared into her eyes. Then he said softly, "Let's get married and have a child." Her lips trembled and her chest heaved up and down as she stared at him in a daze. She did not understand what he meant. After a long time, she came back to her senses. "Actually, we only need to have a child. We don't need to get married. You have your own private life." Yimubai stared at her, his eyes filled with a cold light. When Wen Yuan looked up and saw the expression in his eyes, she shrank back and knew that he was mocking her. "Wen Yuan," he said, "don't you think you're being too cruel to Xiangnan?" He took a step forward and stood less than half a meter away from her. He said hoarsely, "He's sick. He needs a normal family and a father." This book came from Chapter 3754. She stared into his eyes helplessly. His expression was a little impatient. "Don't talk to me about love, understand? Right now, you're playing the role of Yi Xiangnan's mother, not just Wen Yuan." As he spoke, he held her chin and lifted her face, his expression getting closer to hers. "If you don't agree, we don't have to give birth to the child. I'll take him to America." After saying that, he suddenly let go of her face. Wen Yuan couldn't help but take 2 steps back. He strode away, probably to see Xiangnan. Wen Yuan stood there alone. She felt that her surroundings were quiet, and everything had nothing to do with her. In her mind, there was only Yimubai's words. She was Xiangnan's mother, not just Wen Yuan. After some time, when Wen Yuan went to Xiangnan's ward, she saw Yimubai change into sterile clothes and enter. He squatted in front of Xiangnan's bed, his side profile looking especially gentle. He was talking to Xiangnan. There was fragility on Xiangnan's face, but there was also a touch of peace. His little face gently leaned on his father's shoulder, and his little face was shy. At that moment, Wen Yuan thought that Xiangnan needed a father, especially at a time like this. Yimubai was right. Wen Yuan stood outside and watched quietly. When Xiangnan saw her, he gave her a small smile. This smile supported Yimubai and Wen Yuan's subsequent marriage. No matter how cold he was later, she never mentioned a divorce. When Yimubai came out, Xiangnan fell asleep again. He gently closed the door and took off his mask. Wen Yuan stood in front of him, a head shorter than him. They were a little close, and she lowered her head, so he couldn't see her face clearly. He only heard her say softly, "Yimubai, let's get married." He stared at her but didn't say anything. He used Yi Mulan's connections to hire the best medical team to give Xiangnan the best care. Only then did Wen Yuan realize that marrying him had many, many benefits. Yimubai took her back to her apartment. After taking a shower, he quietly smoked a cigarette and looked at her. "I brought the household register." "Ah." She was a little absent-minded, and her expression was blank. He pursed his thin lips. "Get married." Wen Yuan's heart was pounding heavily. After a while, she returned to her room and began to rummage through her household register. Usually, she was a tidy person, but at this time, she had completely forgotten where her household register was. She searched for a long time before she found it. When she went out, Yimubai was still smoking. He looked at her. Wen Yuan stood and looked down. "I'm done." He got up. "Change into your shoes." She went to change her shoes in a panic. She followed his instructions almost immediately. When they reached his car downstairs, he extinguished the cigarette butt and started the car. The person who helped them was the leader of the Civil Affairs Bureau. In other words, it was a secret marriage. Wen Yuan didn't have any objections. At this time, as long as she could save Xiangnan and give her a child, she was willing to do anything. After reading the vows mechanically, they took a photo and stamped it. They became legally married. There was no wedding ring, no kiss. It was just a process. But the result was that she became his wife. This used to be everything in Wen Yuan's dreams. But now, she only felt a little miserable. She even regretted that if she hadn't stubbornly pursued him back then, Xiangnan wouldn't have been born and wouldn't have gotten such an illness. But now, she had no way out. She had to be responsible for her child. No matter how embarrassing this marriage was, she had to endure it. The marriage certificate in her hand was heavy. She looked up. Coincidentally, Yimubai was also looking at her. He didn't say anything. He just placed the certificate in her hand. "Keep it well." Then, he turned around and walked in front. Wen Yuan followed silently. The leader wiped his sweat. This was the first time he didn't know how to bless a pair of newlyweds. He had just gone through the marriage procedures, not a divorce, right? In his opinion, it was more like a funeral scene. Oh my God, this was really difficult. This couple's identities were so prominent. This book came from. Chapter 3755. Yimubai brought Wen Yuan downstairs. When they got into the car, he asked calmly, "Are you going to America, back to B City, or staying here?" Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and said after a long while, "I want to stay here." She didn't want to go to America and Xiangnan wasn't used to it either. Moreover, how could she return to B City after marrying him? She thought that if she stayed in H City, they wouldn't have many chances to meet each other. Perhaps after having a child, he would ask for a divorce because they didn't have feelings for each other. That was what she thought. Yimubai held on to the steering wheel and said calmly, "I won't get a divorce." He turned his head and looked at her quietly. No matter what the quality of this marriage is like. Wen Yuan's breathing was a little chaotic again. Why? He stared at her for a long time but didn't answer her. He started the car, he took her back and told her that he had bought an apartment here and would be moving there today. After Xiangnan was discharged, they would be living there. Wen Yuan was a little shocked. "Why are you moving? Isn't this place good?" He looked around and said calmly, "This place is too small. 100 square meters couldn't accommodate him." Wen Yuan was still a little stunned. He said straightforwardly, "Other than the days when we sleep on the same bed, there's no need for us to sleep together." His words were like a slap to her face. Wen Yuan said calmly, "I understand." He sat on the sofa and glanced at her. "Everything is ready. You just need to pack up your and Xiangnan's clothes." Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and went back to the room to pack his and Xiangnan's things. Yimubai took the 2 big suitcases. The apartment he bought was very close to here. It was only a 5-minute drive. The location was better and the environment was better. Wen Yuan had to admit that it would be more suitable for Xiangnan to recuperate here after being discharged. She didn't object anymore and took it as his concern for Xiangnan. The apartment was a 6-story bungalow. He bought the top floor, which was more than 300 square meters. There were 3 suites, a large living room, and a game room. The renovation was very good and there were soft woolen blankets everywhere, suitable for children. Wen Yuan moved his things into a suite. She thought it was a guest room, but it was actually the master bedroom. Yimubai looked at it and didn't say anything, but his gaze was deep. After Wen Yuan was done cleaning up, he sat quietly in Xiangnan's room for a while. The room was decorated in a Mediterranean style with blue as the main theme. All boys would like it. She gently stroked the bedsheets, a little lost in thought. Yimubai stood at the door of the bedroom and looked at her quietly. "Take a break. We'll visit Xiangnan in the afternoon and come back at night. I don't need to rest." She looked up with her eyes wide open. "I want to go to the hospital now." He looked at her for a long time, then said slowly, "If you want to have healthy children, you'd better listen to me." She bit her lip, nodded, and walked back to her bedroom to lie down. Wen Yuan was lying on the bed. She didn't know what he was doing. Was he resting or something else? The door to her room was open, and she heard him on the phone, probably talking to Lin Danny. Wen Yuan pulled the blanket up silently. She didn't want to listen, nor did she want to hear what he was saying. Yimubai hung up the phone after talking for about 4 to 5 minutes. Later, Wen Yuan heard the sound of the door closing. She slowly sat up. After a while, she walked around the apartment, but he didn't come back. Wen Yuan's heart skipped a beat. She changed her clothes and took a taxi to the hospital this book came from. Chapter 3756. She went to the hospital and went up to that floor. She stood on the other side of the corridor and saw Yimubai standing at the door of the ward, looking at Xiangnan quietly. At that moment, Wen Yuan felt very sad. There were tears in her eyes as she looked straight at him. Yimubai turned his head and saw Wen Yuan. He gazed at her quietly. There was some warmth in his eyes, and they were no longer as cold as before. Wen Yuan walked over and stood next to him. He said hoarsely, "He will be transferred to a normal ward the day after tomorrow. If everything goes well, he can be discharged in 10 days and recuperate at home, but he has to come for a checkup every week." He turned to look at her. "It's best if we have a child within a year." Wen Yuan's face was a little pale. He stared at her and didn't say anything. In the afternoon, Xiangnan woke up for a short while. Wen Yuan went in to see him and talked to him for a while. She reached out and touched her son's hair with a gentle expression on her face. When she came out, it was already night time. There were 2 special class nurses in the ward to take care of him. They went home. Both of them were very tired. After ordering dinner, he went to the study. Wen Yuan was extremely tired. She took a shower and lay on the bed. At midnight, she was woken up by someone kissing her. She opened her eyes and looked at his handsome face under the dim light. At that moment, she was pressed under his body. Wen Yuan woke up immediately. She pursed her lips and looked at him. "Yimubai." He kissed her neck gently. His voice was hoarse. "Is it your pregnancy period?" Wen Yuan opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. He nodded and shook his head. But he knew that it was her pregnancy period. So he lowered his head and kissed her lips, kissing her all the way down. They had done it many times before. Wen Yuan liked it when he hugged her. But it was different this time. She remembered that when she called him, he was taking a shower and it was Lin Danny who picked up the phone. Her imagination was like a wild horse that had broken free. When Yuan's pupils constricted, she suddenly pushed Yimubai away, her body curled up as she sat on the bed, her hands hugging her body. Yimubai narrowed his eyes. Wen Yuan. His expression was slightly distorted because of Yuan. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Wen Yuan struggled instinctively in his arms. "No." "Why not?" He lowered his head and stared at her face unhappily. "Wen Yuan, don't be emotional. Don't you want a child?" Xiangnan is still lying in the hospital. In his arms, she raised her head and looked at him silently. Then, a tear fell from the corner of her eye. He pushed her down again, wanting her. Wen Yuan did not struggle anymore. Her fingers gripped the bedsheets tightly as she endured him in the dim light. It was a little humiliating. She didn't feel much either. She just endured it mechanically, like a puppet. Yimubai didn't seem to have any interest, he just wanted to make her pregnant. After it was over, the air was suffocating. Doing it was more uncomfortable than not doing it. Wen Yuan lay on the bed with tears in the corner of his eyes. Yimubai immediately lifted the quilt and got off the bed. After taking a shower, he walked out of the bedroom. There was no hug after the deed. There was no warmth. There was only obligation. Wen Yuan sat in a daze for a long time. Then she moved her body to the bathroom and washed herself. When she lay on the bed again, she didn't sleep for half the night. She opened her eyes and looked at the dark night outside. It was just like their marriage, it was so cold. Today's update is over. Happy New Year, everyone. New Year's Eve, end of this chapter. Chapter 3757. Wen Yuan lay there quietly for a long time, until her eyes were sore and dry. She didn't know how many times they would have to do it to get pregnant. At this moment, she even regretted taking a shower just now. Just like that, she felt very conflicted and afraid of the future. In the guest room, Yimubai lay flat on his back. The lights were off, and he raised one hand to cover his eyes. The sex incident just now was like a movie in his mind. He was a mature man, and he couldn't be more clear about her reaction just now. When Yuan didn't let go at all. She didn't even feel that she was resisting having sex with him. He probably knew why she was doing it, because Lin Danny was the one who answered the phone that day. Yimubai didn't want to explain to Wen Yuan that their marriage was for Xiangnan, in the past, now, and in the future. He was already very tired, and he didn't want to waste any more time on comforting her little feelings. That's it, he thought lightly. They didn't feel sleepy until the next day. There was nothing special the next day. They went to see Xiangnan together. In the afternoon, when Yuan went to handle the resignation procedures. The reason was that the child was sick, and the hospital tried their best to keep him. Because the female dean was in her 50s, and her daughter was about the same age as Wen Yuan, she felt deeply about Wen Yuan's situation. Moreover, Wen Yuan was excellent in all aspects. The dean sighed in the end. Wen Yuan, as long as you want to come back, you can come to me at any time, as long as I'm in this school. Wen Yuan was also very touched. She nodded vigorously. Okay. When she walked out of the school, Yimubai was sitting in the car. He was wearing sunglasses, but his aura were too strong, especially for girls in their 20s. There were several girls surrounding his car, asking for his autograph. Yimubai ignored them, and his face was expressionless. When Wen Yuan was a few meters away, she stopped in her tracks. She was a little unsure if she should go over or not. Yimubai saw her, and through a layer of sunglasses, she couldn't see his expression clearly. She only knew that his eyes were deep and serene. She still walked over, opened the door quietly, and sat in. He didn't start the car immediately. Instead, he turned sideways. Done. She nodded. Yes, done. He looked at her and started the car. When Yuan thought that they would be silent in the car, but when his slender fingers held the steering wheel and focused on driving, he found time to talk. The content of their conversation was about childbirth. Yimubai's voice was faint. When Yuan, I'll be in H City for a while. He paused for a moment and turned to look at her before continuing, you know what I mean, right? We need to get pregnant in the shortest time possible. So, we need to make love during your pregnancy. I don't want you to reject me. You can choose not to respond, but don't push me away. Otherwise, it'll be hard for me to continue. He spoke calmly, but his words were extremely cruel, making Wen Yuan feel extremely embarrassed. She didn't say anything. She just looked out of the window. Her heart was a little cold, and she couldn't describe the feeling. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. Women were different from men. Her child was sick. As a woman, she was not in the mood to live a married life, not to mention that their marriage was so cold. Wen Yuan didn't want to do it. The more formulaic and mechanical it was, the more disgusted she felt. She even felt that she was dirty. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't say anything. And what was there to say? This book came from Chapter 3758. Back at the apartment, Wen Yuan quietly went to cook. Although she came from a good family, her culinary skills were very good. She couldn't understand why Xiangnan, who had always been healthy, suddenly fell sick. She lowered her eyes and cooked absent-mindedly. She didn't know if it was to fill her stomach or to fulfill her duty as a wife. However, she was thinking that her duty was actually to lie flat and let him make love to her until she got pregnant. Or rather, she had never been his wife, and they were only in a cooperative relationship. She was so absent-minded that she accidentally got a cut on her hand. It wasn't too deep, but a few drops of blood seeped out. Wen Yuan was actually a little numb, but when she saw the dark red blood, she still let out a soft moan. Yimubai was on the phone. When he heard the sound, he quickly walked over. When he saw the blood on her finger, he immediately took a tissue to help her press on the wound. Her hand was surrounded by him. It was warm, strong, and a little rough. He held her hand and looked down at her. "I'll help you bandage it." "No need." Wen Yuan shook her head and bit her lip. He had already brought her to the living room without allowing her to refuse. He took out the first aid kit, helped her disinfect it, and bandaged it with a layer of gauze. Yimubai pursed his lips. "It's done." She moved her finger. There was no problem, so she said softly, "I'll go cook." "No need, order a meal," he said softly. Wen Yuan was very insistent. "It'll be done in a while." With that, she went to the kitchen. Yimubai looked at her back view, his brows furrowed. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. She was running away from him. Although Yimubai didn't care much about their relationship, whether they were husband and wife or not, it didn't matter. But at this moment, he still sighed. Such a marriage. Wen Yuan continued to cook. She made 3 dishes and a soup. It was delicious, especially the thick soup, which had the taste of home. Yimubai sat with her and ate. He looked at the gauze on her fingertips and said softly, "When Xiangnan comes back, find a servant from home. You don't have to find one outside. Just transfer one from home in B City." Wen Yuan raised her eyes and looked at Yimubai warily. She said softly, "Yimubai, do you want others to know that I married your brother before marrying you?" He put down his chopsticks. "What do you have to be afraid of? Or do you think the servants at home wouldn't know that we slept together that afternoon?" Wen Yuan was speechless. She bit her lip. Yimubai continued, "If you don't object, then it's decided. Wen Yuan is not only doing this for you, but also for Xiangnan. You can't care too much after you're pregnant." Wen Yuan no longer objected. She lowered her head and ate very little. Yimubai frowned. "Wen Yuan, I know. I'll try my best to eat more." She looked up at him and said softly, "I'm going to get pregnant." "I know." She ate slowly and tried her best to eat. He realized that she had lost a lot of weight in just a few days. When he held her waist last night, it was very thin. She didn't look like a mother who had given birth to a child at all. Yimubai stared at her for a long time before saying softly, "What I mean is that you need to take care of Xiangnan." She pursed her lips and lowered her head again. She didn't say anything and just ate. Their interaction was very strange. After eating, she felt uneasy, afraid that he would ask to sleep with her. But they couldn't get pregnant if they didn't sleep in the same room. This book came from Chapter 3759. When Yuan lay on the bed, feeling a little tormented. She didn't know if she was waiting for Yimubai to come over, but she really couldn't sleep. As soon as she closed her eyes, she felt that he would suddenly appear in the next second, press on top of her, and do all kinds of things to her. At 12:00 in the morning, when Yuan woke up, her back was covered in sweat. She sat up, hugged herself with her hands, and quietly fell into a daze. After a long time, she looked at the time and lay down again. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore and went to take a shower. She wanted to go outside to get a glass of water. When she passed by Yimubai's room, his bedroom light was on, but there was no one there. When Yuan stood quietly for a while, a little absent-minded. Later, she went to get a glass of water, walked to the French windows, opened the curtains, and quietly looked at the night outside. But when the curtains slowly opened, Wen Yuan's gaze was fixed. She looked at everything in front of her in disbelief. On the first floor, Yimubai was only wearing a shirt and black trousers. A very young girl was hugging him, her slender arms around his neck, and her whole body was in his arms. The girl was very young and beautiful. From the side profile, Wen Yuan could tell that it was Lin Danny. And their hug was a kiss that they hadn't seen for a long time, and a girl's complete dependence. Wen Yuan watched quietly, and the blood in her body seemed to have frozen. She was Yimubai's wife, and she lived in his house. They had a child together, and they were about to have a second child. But on a night like this, she saw another girl with him, and it made her feel that she was actually a third party. Wen Yuan knew that she should avoid it. A smart woman should pretend that she didn't see it, because she still needed Yimubai as her husband. She needed him to make love to her and conceive a child. Although at this moment, she felt as uncomfortable as if she had eaten a fly. Wen Yuan watched as Yimubai gently pushed Lin Danny's hand away, but Lin Danny immediately hugged him again. This time, he didn't push Lin Danny away. Wen Guang watched quietly until he inadvertently looked up and saw Wen Yuan upstairs. His eyes met hers in the dark night, a young girl in his arms. After a long time, Yimubai lowered his head and said something to Lin Danny. Then, they got into the car and Yimubai drove Lin Danny away. Wen Yuan just stood there, looking at the dark night, watching his car disappear. It was as if he would have to wait until dawn. It was as if he would have to wait until the end of time. Of course, she wouldn't wait forever. Half an hour later, she drank the glass of cold water and returned to her bedroom. She lay on the bed, half asleep and half awake. All she could think of were bizarre dreams. When she woke up, the apartment was still quiet. There was no sound at all. Yimubai only came back when it was almost dawn. His voice was very soft. He stood at the door for a while and then went to take a shower. Wen Yuan woke up, but he lay on the bed without moving. He showered, went to her bedroom, and went to her bed. Her pajamas were thrown to the foot of the bed, and he was doing things to make her pregnant. Wen Yuan lay there without moving. But when he looked away, there were tears in his eyes. She didn't ask him about Lin Danny, and he didn't explain either. After such an absurd sex act, he left her and left her bedroom. The house was still quiet. She lay on the bed, her nose a little red, and her eyes even redder. This book came from Chapter 3760. She thought that she didn't care, but when he came back to shower and asked for her again, she felt terrible. That night, it was like a thorn in Wen Yuan's heart, and she couldn't pull it out for many years. It was like she was sick, and no one could save her. Yimubai didn't intend to save her either. All the love, admiration, and love she once had for him completely ended that night, leaving only the image of him and Lin Danny hugging each other. The days passed, and Xiangnan was admitted to a normal ward. Wen Yuan often went to accompany him, and every time she stayed, it would be a whole day. Although Yimubai was in City H, he would fly to other places from time to time. When he wasn't around, Wen Yuan would spend the night in the hospital, and when he was around, she would return to the apartment, because they had to have a child. Although she was already resisting, and even hated doing it with him, she had no choice. She couldn't refuse. On the third day after Yimubai flew to America, an unexpected yet expected girl appeared in front of Wen Yuan. It was Lin Danny. Wen Yuan met her outside the hospital, and they had a cup of coffee together. Lin Danny was very young, and she had a special temperament. Bai Shuali had this temperament, Lin Cece had it, and Wen Yuan also had it, but they were all spoiled when they were young and had a better family background. Wen Yuan never watched gossip. Later on, she found out that Lin Danny was the daughter of a film company, so she was like herself in the past, passionately chasing after a man, as if the whole world had nothing to do with her, and there was only one man in her life. When Yuan lowered her head and took a sip of coffee, she deliberately didn't add sugar, so it was a little bitter. But she would rather it be a little bitter, so that she would be a little more clear-headed in front of a girl who was 5 years younger than her. Lin Danny was more photogenic than in the movies. Her face was very small, and she was very beautiful. When Yuan took a look at her, and she knew why Yi Mubai chose her as the female lead, and even why they were together. Because Lin Danny was very much like someone. Very much like Lin Cece, the person that Yi Mubai had been thinking about until now. Lin Danny said faintly, "I didn't know you were married, Miss Wen. You don't mind me calling you Miss Wen, right? I know you. You're very famous in B City. Not only are you the daughter of the Wen family, but you're also Yi Mulan's former wife. But I won't admit that you're Mubai's wife. Although you've registered your marriage, I don't think he sees you as his wife." When Yuan looked at the girl in front of him and smiled. "Call me whatever you want." Lin Danny's gaze was a little aggressive, but it wasn't strange. Not many girls like her were innocent, and Wen Yuan never thought that he was. Lin Danny stared into Wen Yuan's eyes and said softly, "I won't give up on him. Your marriage to him will not last." Wen Yuan still lowered her head and sipped the coffee in the cup. After a while, she said in a low voice, "Then keep a low profile. Legally, he's a married man, and you're the most talented actress in China. Don't ruin yourself. I don't care. The most important person in my life is Yi Mubai. I just want to live in front of his camera." Lin Danny brushed her hair indifferently. When Yuan raised her eyes and looked at the girl in front of her in a daze. She seemed to have said these words before, but now, it was all in the past. This book came from Chapter 3761. When Yuan looked at the girl in front of her. After a long time, she smiled faintly. She paid for the coffee and left. There was no accusation, no quarrel, nothing. It was because she knew that Yi Mubai didn't belong to her. Quarreling would only embarrass herself. Lin Danny could hug Yi Mubai and act coquettishly, but Wen Yuan couldn't. She was Xiangnan's mother. After seeing Lin Danny, Wen Yuan didn't have many thoughts. Even if she had any thoughts, it was that night. That night had already passed, she didn't have any thoughts. She didn't ask Yi Mubai if he and Lin Danny had sex that night. She didn't want to ask and felt that there was no need to. Sometimes, it was better to be a little muddled about marriage, especially between her and Yi Mubai. When Yuan went back to the ward, Xiangnan was sleeping quietly. This child had to sleep for more than 10 hours every day after he got sick. When Yuan felt sorry for him but also felt lucky. This way, Xiangnan wouldn't be in so much pain. In the afternoon, more people came. It was quite surprising. It wasn't just Bai Shuali and Yi Mulan. Even Lin Cece came. When Yuan never hated Lin Cece. There was no reason to hate her. It wasn't wrong to be liked. Xiangnan fell asleep. Bai Shuali stayed by his side and kissed Xiangnan. When Yuan felt a surge of warmth in his heart. Bai Shuali had liked Yi Mubai for many years, so she probably had special feelings for Xiangnan when she saw him. What surprised Wen Yuan even more was that Yi Mulan brought a few medical reports and bone marrow biopsy tests. There were his, Su Fu's and even Yi Xinggang's. When he handed it to Wen Yuan, his voice was soft but powerful. "If necessary, I have discussed it with Shuali. Anan can also accept the test." Wen Yuan's eyes were very hot. She reached out and took it. She knew that it was a very precious gift. The Yi family and Xiangnan's blood were all here. She didn't know what to say. She just clenched her fists and said in a low voice, "Yi Mubai and I want to have a child first. If it doesn't work, we will need these." She looked up. "Mulin, thank you." Yi Mulin reached out and gently touched her hair. For someone who had lived together for a few years, Wen Yuan was like a younger sister. Moreover, they weren't completely unrelated. Xiangnan was Yi Mulin's blood-related child. Wen Yuan nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Yi Mulin, Bai Shuali, and Lin Sisi spent the night in City H. At night, Xiangnan woke up and was especially happy to see Yi Mulin. For the first time, he left the bed and was hugged by Yi Mulin. When Bai Shuali saw Yi Mulin holding Xiangnan, her expression was very soft. She felt that he was really a good father, not only to Anan, but also to Xiangnan. Beside her, Lin Sisi nudged her and said, "Your Yi Mulin is a good father." Bai Shuali looked at her. "Isn't Guze good? Sisi, you guys should have a child." She knew that Lin Sisi had been using contraception ever since they got married. Lin Sisi once told her, "Why are you avoiding it? It's not like you can give birth." She was just bluffing. If she couldn't give birth, she could just say that she was using contraception. Lin Sisi leaned against her and said softly, "See, you can't blame me if you can't give birth." Her eyes were a little red. Actually, she had been a mother before, but it was too short. However, Guze seemed to be even more reserved than her. He never dared to mention children in front of her. She thought that maybe she should try again. If she couldn't get pregnant, she could only leave it to fate. Xiangnan liked the two aunties very much. He even went out for a meal with the doctor's permission. Because of his physique, Yi Mulin booked a Michelin restaurant just for Xiangnan. When they arrived, they remembered that it was Xiangnan's birthday. Cake, gifts, and a restaurant that was dressed as a birthday party. Xiangnan's little face was slightly red. He hadn't been happy for many days. Wen Yuan hugged him and kissed him. "Are you happy?" She didn't expect Yi Mulin and the others to prepare these. Xiangnan said that he was happy. Yi Mulin smiled faintly and said, "Shueli contacted this restaurant beforehand. Even the doctor confirmed it before they prepared it. She flew here in the morning with Sisi." Then, he paused for a moment. "There's also a special gift." Xiangnan looked at it eagerly. His heart was full of desire. At this moment, he felt as if he had opened Pandora's box. He was nervous and expectant. Amidst the music, Bai Anan, wearing an awkward little dress, pushed a small cart and sang, "Happy Birthday Brother," in a tone-deaf voice. She looked cute and adorable, and the song she sang was, "Happy Birthday Brother." Xiangnan was very young, but he was very sensitive. He liked Anton very much. In his eyes, Anton appeared like an angel. Later, when Xiangnan grew up, he became a sister complex. Bai Anan became his favorite, even surpassing his younger brother. This book came from Chapter 3762. There was a faint blush on Xiangnan's little face. He really wanted to hug Anton, but he was a little weak and couldn't do so he could only look at Bai Anan. Bai Anan was the prettiest girl Yi Xiangnan had ever seen in her little dress. Bai Anan tried her best to push the little cart over and sang with all her might. In the end, she even kissed Xiangnan on the cheek. Yi Xiangnan's little friend blushed. Wen Yuan watched with mixed feelings, but she was also happy. After so many days of tension, she finally smiled. The warmth she received was given to her by Yi Mulin and by Shuali, as well as to Xiangnan. Wen Yuan remembered the candlelight birthday boy, and Bai Anan, who was wearing a little dress awkwardly that night. Happiness was always a little short-lived. Xiangnan's body didn't allow him to stay outside for long, so after 2 hours, Yi Mulin sent them back to the hospital. Xiangnan was still very happy. And then stayed there to accompany him. She took out the comic book that she had drawn and flipped through it for Xiangnan to read. The two little ones sat together on the hospital bed, and they seemed to be very close. Bai Shuili watched and said to Wen Yuan, Xiangnan is really very sensible. She always had feelings for Yi Mubai when they grew up. She didn't want Yi Mubai to miss out on a good woman like Wen Yuan. Bai Shuili's voice was very soft. Wen Yuan, give Mubai some time. I believe that you will get better. Wen Yuan only smiled faintly. It wasn't appropriate for Bai Shuili to ask too much about the matters between husband and wife, so she didn't say anything else. Bai Shuili and Yi Mulin went back first, while An stayed there to accompany Xiangnan. Because it was a VIP ward, Wen Yuan slept on a bed alone, and the two little ones slept together intimately. Although An was very small, Wen Yuan felt very warm with An by his side. At night, when she was covering the little fellows with blankets, Wen Yuan secretly kissed An. She thought to herself, if she was pregnant and could give birth to a little girl, how great would that be? Looking at An, she didn't seem to reject pregnancy so much. It was a dark night in H City. Yi Mulin drove Bai Shuili back to the hotel. It was not easy for him to come here. His identity was a problem. He had to leave early the next morning. Shuili planned to stay with An for a few days. Lin Cece came with Guzei. As soon as they left the hospital, Guzei took her away. As for Yi Mubai, Guzei still cared. Men were all like that. At this moment, Bai Shuili was sitting beside Yi Mulin. She tilted her head and looked at him. Her voice was quite soft. Mulin, are you not going to care about Mubai? Yi Mulin smiled faintly. How? Only a man can control his lower body. I'm not talking about that. Bai Shuili bit her lips. I mean, he has so many scandals with so many people. You are his big brother, of course you can control it. Yi Mulin was focused on driving. After hearing his wife's words, he smiled faintly. I really can't control this matter. Mubai is an adult, and the relationship between him and Wen Yuan is very complicated. In my opinion, it's not that he has no feelings for Wen Yuan, but that it's not deep enough. He still has some resistance. Bai Shuili glanced at her husband bitterly. Yi Mulin, you're too weak. Yi Mulin just smiled. After a while, when they reached a red light, he turned his head to look at her. That gaze was very meaningful. It made Bai Shuili feel a little scared. She sat up straight and looked at her husband. Why are you looking at me like that? He reached out and rubbed his chin with his beautiful fingers. I'm thinking, what should I do to make Mrs. Yi feel that I'm strong? Shameless. Bai Shuili turned her face to the side and ignored him. After a while, she couldn't help but turn her head and complain to him. The older you get, the more indecent you are. Yi Mulin continued to drive. After a long time, his voice rang out. Do you think I'm old? His little worm said softly, yes, you are old. Don't be unconvinced. He just smiled and didn't say anything. When they reached the hotel, Yi Mulin carried his wife up. Bai Shuili exclaimed, Yi Mulin, what are you doing? Book from Chapter 3763. Bai Shuili's face was blushing as her hands landed on the buttons of his shirt. Her voice was soft and delicate. Yi Mulin, you can't be thinking about it, right? Your private flight is at 8 a.m. tomorrow and you're going to have to change to a helicopter for a meeting at 10 a.m. Just the thought of it makes me feel so busy. He looked at his little wife deeply and lowered his head to kiss her. It's tough, isn't it? Furthermore, you're going to be spending a week here. If you don't fulfill your obligations as a couple during this week, shouldn't I collect some interest first? Her little face continued to blush as she said pitifully, doing it once, is just the interest. Yi Mulin's fingers caressed her face gently as his voice was especially soft. Actually, you can pay the principal first. She was still stuttering. What do you mean, pay the principal first? Yi Mulin lowered his head to kiss her. After that, he pulled back and brushed past her lips gently, hinting at her. Do it a few more times. Before she could resist, he had already proceeded without any delay. After a few more times, Baishuali laid on the bed and complained softly, "You're already so old and yet you don't know how to take care of your health." Yi Mulin chuckled and got up happily, carrying her to shower. By then, it was already late at night. He hugged her in his arms while he leaned against the headboard and smoked a cigarette. Baishuali raised her head and looked at his furrowed brows as well as his cigarette. Usually, he wouldn't smoke at home. Even if he did, he would do it on the balcony. Furthermore, he was in a particularly bad mood after they had done it. Reaching out, she wrapped her slender arms around his neck and buried her face between his chin and neck. Weren't you in a good mood earlier on? Why are you smoking now? Yi Mulin lowered his head and looked at her. However, he had extinguished the cigarette and pinched her cheeks. All right, time to sleep. He was very gentle. In fact, ever since he had thought things through, he had been really nice to her. He was so nice that Baishuali was starting to regret running away all these years. She did not want to say anything, and he was waiting for her to take the initiative to talk about it. Their life was very sweet. They had already gotten their marriage certificate and were just short of a wedding. But now that Mubai and Wen Yuan were like this, their wedding might have to be postponed. Baishuali knew that he was upset, so she took the initiative to get up from his arms. She leaned over to his side and grabbed a cigarette and lighter. She lit the cigarette and took it off her lips. She choked on it and placed it on his lips. Are you worried about Mubai? Yi Mulin stared at her, but he still took the cigarette from her. He slowly took a puff and said faintly, Mubai probably hates Wen Yuan right now. This feeling was very complicated. Even Mubai himself couldn't figure it out. Baishuali bit her lip and said softly after a while, I think he likes Wen Yuan. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the energy to sleep with him. Besides, if he wants a child, he can do it in a test tube. He doesn't need to get married. I can see that Mubai has a strong desire to pester him until he dies. After she said that, she raised her head and looked at him eagerly, hoping for his approval. Yi Mulin, don't you think so? Am I right? He looked at her with a deep gaze. Then, he said slowly, you're quite right. She was a little smug. Yi Mulin continued, if he doesn't like him, why does he have the energy to sleep with him? As he said that, his finger gently caressed her red lips. He then extinguished the cigarette and said with a hoarse voice, next week's benefits in advance. Book from Chapter 3764. Baishuali was dumbfounded again. She placed her hands on his shoulders and sensed that he was about to make a move. She bit her lip and said, you have to rush early tomorrow. With that, she kissed him and said, Yi Mulin, be good, okay? Her eyes were shining. Be good. It was the first time that she had coaxed him like this. She kissed him every time she said something, which made Yi Mulin's heart soften. After so many years, after so many things, she finally returned to his side safe and sound. Time passed by quickly, and they would always be good. Yi Mulin lowered his head, kissed her little face, and said, "Good." Bai Shuali looked up at him and said, "Are you really good? Otherwise?" He looked at her and said, "Do you keep messing with me?" She was a little embarrassed. She lay in his arms and rubbed against him like a kitten, which was indescribably cute. Yi Mulin's heart was extremely soft. He looked down at her and said, "If you go on like this, I can't guarantee that I won't do anything to you." She cried out and lay on him even more coquettishly, hugging him. Yi Mulin turned on the light and let her lie on his body and sleep. They were a couple who had just reconciled, so they would never get tired of it. At dawn, Yi Mulin had to rush to the airport. It was 7:00 in H City, and it was early winter. When Bai Shuali woke up, he had already put on his clothes and was tying his tie. She immediately got up and knelt on the bed and said, "Let me do it." He bent down and kissed her on the face. "You can sleep a little longer later." She tied his tie for him. Yi Mulin did not straighten up immediately, but gently rubbed against her again. Bai Shuali's voice was a little low. "Mulin, let me take you to the airport, okay?" He patted her. "Don't get up. It's cold. Sleep a little longer in the hotel. And don't run around with and without me, okay?" She nodded obediently. Her expression was extremely gentle, as if she had returned to his little wife. Yi Mulin's Adam's apple rolled sexily. He couldn't help kissing her and said, "I'll come over when I'm free." "Don't." She immediately said, and then whispered under his suspicious gaze, "It's too hard." His eyes were blazing. Bai Shuali bit her lips and stared at him. Then, she leaned into his arms. "I'll go back early. Be good." When he opened his mouth, his voice was hoarse. "I should be the one saying that." She blushed and did not make a sound. She placed her hands on his chest and lifted her head to kiss him of her own accord. He didn't move and let her kiss him. After a long time, she panted and said, "Yi Mulin, I'll miss you. You haven't thought about it for so many years, and now you can't stand it anymore." He rubbed her hair and smiled. She bit her lip. "This is different." As for what was different, she did not know. Yi Mulin still couldn't bear for her to get up and send him off. After a while of tenderness, he still rushed back to B City for the meeting. Bai Shuali did not slack off for long. She lay down and talked with Lin Cece for a while. Lin Cece was taken away by Guze. After putting down the phone, he lay down for a while before getting up to brush his teeth and wash up. Then, he changed into a set of clothes and went to the hospital. When Yuan was alone now. He must be too busy, and Anan was also there. Bai Shuali went to the hospital. Anan and Xiangnan were still sleeping. They slept side by side like two cute little pigs. In fact, the two little guys were only a month apart. Xiangnan was born a month earlier and was a little older. This book came from Chapter 3765. Bai Shuali went in and closed the door gently. When Yuan turned back and smiled. "They're not awake yet." Bai Shuali went over and looked at the two little fellows with Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan nodded. They slept a little late. Bai Shuali looked at the two little ones and said with some surprise, "They look so similar." Actually, Mu Lin and Mu Bai don't look so alike. Wen Yuan smiled. "Is that so?" She looked at Bai Shuali and hesitated for a moment. "Shuali, can we talk?" Bai Shuali was stunned for a moment and then agreed. Okay, let's talk outside. Don't disturb them. They're sleeping so soundly. The two of them went outside together. When Yuan made fruit tea for Bai Shuali and sat down with her. I made it myself. Bai Shuali took a sip. It was sweet and she smiled. It's delicious. It's good that you like it. When Yuan continued. I'll send some back to Bi City for you. Bai Shuali accepted it shamelessly. Then she looked at Wen Yuan and said softly, Wen Yuan, I'm sorry. I didn't know you liked Mu Bai too. If that was the case, I wouldn't have chased him for so many years and ended up not with him. She felt that if she didn't rely on Mu Bai, Wen Yuan might have had a chance. Wen Yuan shook his head. Don't think like that. It's just my personality. It has nothing to do with you. You see, after you and Mu Lin got married, he still didn't choose me. Actually, my family tried to reconcile with him but he never expressed it. He didn't mean it. It was my obsession that led to what happened later. Bai Shuali stared at her for a long time. Wen Yuan smiled. What's wrong? The white rice worm slowly opened its mouth and said, Actually, Wen Yuan, you're really amazing. Look at how I'm so straightforward when it comes to chasing a man. I've shamelessly followed Xiao Bai for so many years and even got married. When that bastard Lin Cece appeared, Mu Bai ran away. After saying that, she felt that she had said something wrong and said in a low voice, Actually, Cece is in the past. She and Guze are going to get married. Wen Yuan smiled. I know. I won't be at ease. Bai Shuali said carefully, Wen Yuan, I really think that Lao Bai likes you. Otherwise, he wouldn't want to marry you. After saying that, she put on a confident look again. I'm not wrong. It's a woman's intuition. Wen Yuan said slowly, a woman's intuition tells me that he's in America and Lin Danny is there too. Bai Shuali was a little depressed. I heard that Lin Danny's father is a big shot in the movie industry. Mu Bai, you can't be so shameless. If you want money, it's not like the Yi family doesn't have it. There's no reason for you to sacrifice yourself. Wen Yuan's voice became even more distant. Lin Shui, Lin Danny, don't you realize that they all look a little like Lin Cece? This time, Bai Shuali opened her mouth wide. Fuck, there's actually such a thing. But it does seem to be true. It took her a long time to come back to her senses. She carefully said, then, what do you think about Lin Danny? No, I just want Xiangnan to be well. I don't want anything else. Wen Yuan took a sip of tea and smiled bitterly. So, Shuali, don't worry about us. Really, I've already woken up from my dream. Bai Shuali replied with an oh. Just as she was about to speak, she saw Yi Mu Bai standing at the door. She cursed in her heart. When did he come over? How could she not know? This book came from. Chapter 3766. Yi Mu Bai walked in slowly and paused. How's Xiangnan? Wen Yuan said softly, he's sleeping with an N. He hasn't woken up yet. Yi Mu Bai looked at Bai Shuali again. Bai Shuali looked a little uncomfortable. She flipped her hair and said, I'm going out for a while. Lao Bai just came back. They must have something to talk about. It wasn't convenient for her to be around. Bai Shuali was a little annoyed. She had just talked about Lao Bai's scandal and he came back. She was in a dilemma. But she was still worried that Lao Bai would make things difficult for Wen Yuan. She sneaked a glance at him when she went out. Yi Mu Bai glared at her, and she immediately closed the door. Then, she thought about how she was actually Lao Bai's sister-in-law. She should be dignified in front of him. Why did she not have the slightest bit of prestige? How disappointing. She patted her head and thought that she would definitely teach Lao Bai a lesson the next time they met. Sob sob, it was too embarrassing. If Yi Mulin knew about this, he would definitely laugh at her and say that she was useless. In the ward, Yi Mubai went to see An and Xiangnan. The two kids were still asleep, so he walked out and sat where Bai Shuali was sitting. When Yuan looked up at him. Didn't you say that you're going to be in America for a week? There's an international film festival in City H, he said briefly. I'll be back for a week. When Yuan nodded. I got it. His film's post-production had been completed and it might be competing for awards. There were many such events. Moreover, the film was very popular, so it was all over the world. Other than seeing Xiangnan, he probably came back to have a child with her. The home he prepared was like a hotel to him. When Yuan didn't want to go back, she preferred to stay in the hotel. She was even afraid that he would come back. If he came back, she would have to go back to that place, lie on that humiliating bed and make love to him. She didn't know how he could continue doing it with her now that he had Lin Danny. When Yuan knew that she wasn't young anymore, she didn't know why he wanted to get married. Wasn't it better to stay single in the future? Wasn't he afraid that she would take things too hard and pester him again? She remained silent. Yi Mubai paused for a moment, then said, "The crew will walk the red carpet." She looked into his eyes. She did not seem to understand what he meant, but in fact, she knew exactly what he meant. He was the director, and Lin Danny was the lead actress. It was normal to create a scandal. Was he going to tell her that he was going to have a big affair with Lin Danny in City H? She looked at him for a long time before she smiled. I know. Just 3 words, nothing else. His face turned a little ugly, and then he laughed at himself. When Yuan didn't know what his smile meant, but she had something to tell him about Xiangnan. What she said to Bai Shuali was true. She couldn't care less about Yi Mubai now. He could be with any woman he wanted. She only wanted Xiangnan to be fine. She was even willing to endure that kind of humiliating sex for Xiangnan, even if she thought he was dirty now and felt a little disgusted when doing it with him. She lowered her head. Mulin came yesterday. He flew back to City B early this morning and brought this with him. She stood up and took out the few reports from the hospital for him. She lowered her eyes. Yi Mulin, let's do it too. If we can't have a baby, we can use another plan. This book came from Chapter 3767. It won't be impossible. He held them and looked down at them for a while. Then, he looked up at her. When Yuan, do you always think like this? She bit her lip and said firmly, let's do it. I don't want anything to go wrong. Yi Mubai, maybe Xiangnan is just a child to you, but to me, he's my everything. He listened to her and carefully thought about her words. Then, he smiled faintly and mysteriously. When Yuan, he's your everything, right? He repeated her words and didn't say anything else. Because An and Xiangnan woke up, he went to hold his son. He hadn't seen Xiangnan for a few days, so it was inevitable that Xiangnan was a little clingy to him. When Yuan took care of An silently. When he put on the clothes for the little guy, she looked at the cute An and thought to herself that it would be great if she gave birth to a child like An. She wanted a daughter. Xiangnan seemed to like An. She thought absent-mindedly. On the other side, Yi Mubai took care of Xiangnan. Then, he carried one little guy in each hand and walked to the bathroom. Later, he took care of the two little guys and ate breakfast together. He was very patient and meticulous. Wen Yuan was a little confused when he saw it. He might be a good father, but he wouldn't be a good husband if his wife was Wen Yuan. Later, Bai Shuali came back and whispered to Wen Yuan, "Do you usually get along with him like this?" It was too cold. How were they like husband and wife? Wen Yuan smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Bai Shuali didn't say anything either. It was a matter between husband and wife. Because Yi Mubai suddenly came back, Bai Shuali left with an in the afternoon. They stayed in H City for 2 days and then returned to B City. At this time, Xiangnan was also allowed to leave the hospital by the doctor. When Yuan packed his things and Yi Mubai accompanied his son. She listened to their conversation while packing. Xiangnan liked Yi Mubai a lot, but Xiangnan had grown up with Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan could feel that they both liked each other. Xiangnan treated Yi Mubai with more caution than Yi Mulin. She thought that Xiangnan probably didn't feel safe because she didn't take care of him personally. She packed up her things, looked up at them and said softly, "It's done." The couple had spent the past 2 days in the hospital. He didn't mention going back to the apartment, probably because he knew she wasn't pregnant, Wen Yuan thought silently. After she finished speaking, Yi Mubai looked up at her and said mildly, "Let's go." He picked up Xiangnan and carried the luggage with one hand. He was very tall, so it was easy for him. Wen Yuan only needed to follow him. Along the way, they met doctors and nurses. They all knew each other after half a month. They all saw the relationship between Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan, so they all smiled and said, "Goodbye, Mr. and Mrs. Yi." Wen Yuan felt uncomfortable and just nodded stiffly. However, Yi Mubai didn't seem to care. He carried Xiangnan downstairs to the parking lot, opened the trunk with one hand and put the luggage in. Then, he put Xiangnan in the back seat and gestured for Wen Yuan to get in. Only then did he get in the car, start the car and drive towards the apartment. On the way, Wen Yuan suddenly said, "You might be very busy later. I want you to bring Xiangnan back to the original apartment when you're not here." Yi Mubai frowned and wanted to reach for a cigarette. However, when he thought that Xiangnan was in the car, he gave up. Book from Chapter 3768. He glanced at the rearview mirror and said mildly, "If you don't like it, you can find another one until you're satisfied with it." She didn't know if he was mocking her or something else. She was a little embarrassed, but she didn't want to argue in front of Xiangnan, so she turned her face away and looked out of the window quietly, not bringing it up again. As Yi Mubai drove, he would occasionally look at her expression in the rearview mirror. After a long time, the car stopped at the entrance of the condominium. He got out of the car and took his luggage, while Wen Yuan carried Xiangnan. They looked like a family of 3, but they were too cold. Back at the condominium, she tidied up her things briefly and went to make handmade wontons for Xiangnan. Yi Mubai accompanied Xiangnan. After making it, the little guy's stomach was warm and full, and he couldn't help but want to sleep. This was also a temporary side effect of the treatment. He would want to sleep very much. Xiangnan fell asleep and Wen Yuan walked out. Yi Mubai was sitting in the living room smoking. The window was open. She walked over and sat down opposite him. He looked up at her and took a deep puff of his cigarette before saying mildly, "You still want to go back to live? Do you hate this place, or do you hate me?" Wen Yuan looked out of the window and said in a faint voice, "Yi Mubai, do you think it's interesting for us to be like this?" As soon as she finished speaking, he reached out and grabbed her arm. Before she could react, he pulled her into his arms and pressed her down on the sofa. He knelt on both sides of her body and pinched her chin with his fingers. In a low voice, he said, "When Yuan, what else are you dissatisfied with? Do you want me to tell you that I love you, or do you want me to treat you like how Yi Mulan treated by Shuali? I don't." She turned her face to the side, looking very embarrassed. He stared into her eyes. "Then why are you still playing with me? Isn't this good?" She turned her face and stared at him. He said it was good, but she didn't know what was good about it. She felt that it was a little ridiculous. Between them, what was good about it? Perhaps it didn't matter to him. He traveled all over the world, he had all kinds of beauties by his side, he treated this place like a hotel, and she might have to face 2 children and a loveless marriage, but he actually said it was good. But she couldn't refute. When Yuan's pupils contracted. Slowly, she calmed down and said softly, "Let me go." Yimubai pinches her chin with his slender fingers and says softly, "Do you hate me?" He laughed coldly. "Weren't you crazy about me before? Why don't you like me now, huh?" She bit her lip, unwilling to answer. She could only turn her face away from him. Because his expression was too cold. Yimubai stared at her, and then he lowered his head to kiss her. She was startled when his hot, thin lips covered hers, and he pinched her chin, forcing her to turn her head. At first, she thought it was just a punitive kiss, but then she realized his intention. He kissed all the way to her neck, his voice low. "Do it again." Stunned, when Yuan subconsciously wanted to push him away. She didn't want to do it with him. But he still pressed her down and stared into her eyes with a burning gaze. "What are you doing?" "When Yuan, I don't need to remind you that this is the duty of a married couple, right?" She closed her eyes and said softly, "I'm not pregnant." Book from Chapter 3769. After a long time, he didn't speak or continue. Finally, she couldn't help but open her eyes to look at him. His gaze was strange and cold. He stared at her eyes and said slowly, "When Yuan, who told you that we can only have sex once when you're pregnant? Or do you think that I don't need a woman to be satisfied? Or do you want me to develop outside?" Under his strong aura, when Yuan looked weak and helpless. She closed her eyes again. "Yimubai, didn't you?" He stared at her face for a long time before he angrily lowered his head and forcefully kissed her lips. He kissed her especially forcefully, as if he wanted to hurt her and make her feel pain. That way, she wouldn't be so numb, right? When Yuan cried out softly, "It hurts." He continued to bite her and said in a deep voice, "I thought you didn't feel pain." Although she didn't want to, he still followed his male instinct and used some brute force to possess her. When Yuan cried because of his naughtiness, she hugged his neck and cried loudly while begging him to go to the bedroom. He didn't care and continued. His voice was cold but with a hint of decadence. "It's normal for a husband and wife to do it on the sofa." After that, when Yuan didn't have the strength to resist anymore. After that, he carried her to the bedroom and did it twice more, as if he wanted to make up for what he had done for the past few days. After that, he went to take a shower, and when Yuan lay down, she quietly thought about whether he couldn't be satisfied with Lin Danny or whether he couldn't treat that spoiled girl like he treated her. At this moment, when Yuan forgot that she was born into a good family. From a certain point of view, she was born into a better family than Lin Danny. Perhaps it was because the person she liked first was inferior. Lin Danny was young and looked like Lin Cece, so, when Yuan laughed at herself, she was not even as good as a substitute. She didn't lie down all the time. A woman who wasn't loved by her husband didn't have the right to lie down all the time. She had a lot of housework to do. She tidied up and had lunch. Although her legs were sore, she tried her best to endure it. After cleaning up, she went to prepare lunch. Yumubai frowned when he came out. He walked to the kitchen and asked, "Where's the servant at home?" "I won't be home these few days, so I gave her a break. She went back to B City to visit her family and will be back tomorrow," Wen Yuan said calmly as though nothing had happened. Although the servant would only be back tomorrow, she had to clean up the sofa and carefully wipe it with tissue paper. Even after wiping it several times, she was still worried that it would be seen through. In fact, Yumubai saw that she had used up half of the paper. He paused for a moment and said, "You don't have to care so much. It's normal for a couple to do it outside. What are you worried about?" Wen Yuan was actually bold and conservative. She used to be very open when she was with him, but she was a reserved woman outside and didn't show her emotions. To be honest, she wasn't the type of woman that Yumubai liked. This was probably the reason why they had been entangled for so long, but there was only sex and no love. He liked her body and liked to do it with her, but he didn't want to be with her for a long time. Even now, he felt that he was just making do with it. For the sake of Xiangnan, he felt that they had to live like a married couple no matter what. But obviously, this was just his wishful thinking. She didn't have such plans. She didn't want to live as a married couple. It was also awkward to do it on the sofa. After Yumubai finished speaking, Wen Yuan's hand paused for a moment. Then, she looked at him and said softly after a long time, "Yumubai, I can do it with you, but please respect my habits. Otherwise, I don't know how to live." He leaned against the countertop and watched her cook. In fact, he knew that she wasn't having a good time at the moment. He had done it a few times, and she had almost been exhausted by him. He could have asked her not to do it and done it for her, but he didn't say it. He must be angry, he thought. At that moment, Yumubai was only wearing a pair of denim trousers. It was very sturdy, and he stood beside her. Wen Yuan turned a blind eye to it. After a while, Yumubai chuckled. "Wen Yuan, don't you think you look like you're sexually apathetic right now?" Her face was a little pale, and her fingers paused for a moment. After a long time, she said softly, "Maybe." He glanced at her and left. He returned to his bedroom and put on a pure black V-neck sweater. Then, he took his car keys and went out. At night, when he looked at the news, Wen Yuan found out that he had gone to pick up Lin Danny. Their photos at the airport were taken by the reporters, and Lin Danny was hugging him in public. They looked like a golden couple, and it seemed like Yumubai was still single. Wen Yuan looked at the news and blinked gently. So it could be like this. So it turned out that married people could go to bed with their wives and hug their lovers. This book came from Chapter 3770. After Yumubai left, Wen Yuan took care of Xiangnan. She had almost no time to think about Yumubai, let alone Lin Danny. She had a negative attitude towards their marriage, from the beginning to the end. However, she was still a little absent-minded, and it was obviously because of Yumubai. He came back at night, close to midnight. When Yuan and the child were already asleep. Yumubai paused for a moment, then went to the nursery to see Xiangnan. Xiangnan had always been very obedient, even when he was sleeping. He lay there obediently, and his little face looked especially calm under the night light. Even the fine hair on his face could be clearly seen, making him look even softer. Yumubai looked at his son under the light, and his heart softened. He sat down and reached out to gently touch Xiangnan's little face. He was afraid of waking him up, so his movements were especially gentle. He thought that he liked Xiangnan very much, so from the beginning to the end, he didn't want to go into the city with Wen Yuan. As soon as Xiangnan fell sick, he was willing, and he took the initiative. He had once wondered if he had been wrong when Wen Yuan had been particularly cold to him. However, looking at Xiannan's gentle expression, he felt that he had been right and that everything had been the right thing to do. Regardless of whether their marriage satisfied the adults, it made Xiangnan feel at ease, and that was enough. Yimubai sat for a long time before going to Wen Yuan's bedroom. He didn't want to do it with her, but simply wanted to see her. She had rejected him so coldly during the day, and he had almost forced himself, so he wanted to come and see her. He walked into her bedroom, and there was a feminine fragrance in it. It was very similar to the smell on Wen Yuan's body, and it was always fragrant. Yimubai's expression softened a little, and he walked in under the dim light. He stood in front of the bed and looked at her, then saw her phone on the bedside table. His gaze darkened, and his long hand reached out to grab it. He reached out and swiped it, then saw the page she had opened. Yimubai looked at the page for a long time, then looked at her, a little surprised. On the page was a photo of him and Lin Danny hugging. It was taken at the airport today. It could be considered a publicity stunt, but he did not deny it to the media. He also did not tell Wen Yuan about it. Their relationship as a couple was not that good. Yimubai thought so. Then he turned off her phone. Just as he was about to leave, Wen Yuan woke up. Her eyes were like a stream of light in the night, contrasting with her fair face, making her look very beautiful. Yimubai was a director, and he had high aesthetic standards. He always knew that Wen Yuan was beautiful, but her beauty was a little bland. But at this moment, she was not like that in his eyes. In the dim light, she emitted a soft light like a pearl. It was beautiful. Yimubai originally wanted to leave, but he stayed. Wen Yuan just stared at him in a daze. They were both studying each other's expressions, as if they could find something from those subtle changes. After a long time, he knelt beside her and began to kiss her. Wen Yuan did not react at first, and let him kiss her passionately. After a long time, when he was trying to think of what to do, her hand hit the phone on the bedside table. In an instant, Wen Yuan woke up. Her eyes were open, and she looked at the man on top of her, a little frightened. She instinctively pushed him away. Then, she clutched her collar and said softly, "I don't want to do it." He was flipped to the side, and then he stared at her and said unhappily, "But I want to." Book from Chapter 3771. You're jealous, aren't you? One as he spoke, he pulled her under him and kissed her on the lips, burning her once. After that, Wen Yuan turned his back and was still panting. Yimubai didn't leave immediately. Instead, he leaned against the bed and wanted to smoke, but he gave up on it. He lowered his head and looked at her, his voice low. "What's wrong now? Don't say that you don't like me treating you like this. You clearly felt it just now." When a woman did it with a man, whether she felt it or not, men could actually feel it. She might be against it, but when he wanted her, her body didn't express it that way. After he asked, she was still lying on her stomach, unwilling to talk to him. "Lin Danny." Yimubai snorted softly. "There's nothing between us. I also like to fool around outside." Wen Yuan buried her face in the pillow and listened to him. She suddenly asked him softly, "Lin Danny, Lin Shui, they're both like Lin Cece, right? They're both surnamed Lin. Yimubai, why don't you find someone with the surname Lin to marry?" Her fingers touched the pillow and her voice was faint. "We can get a divorce, really. You care about her existence." Yimubai reached out to hold her chin and forced her to turn to look at him. His appearance and strength were a little barbaric. His voice was low. When Yuan, you were the one who said that you don't want feelings. You were the one who said that you don't like me. Since that's the case, why do you care so much about what I have with other people? She wanted to dodge, but he didn't allow her to. He held her face as if he wanted to look into the depths of her soul. After a long time, when Yuan said in a hoarse voice, "You're right, Yimubai. I don't need to care, but I have the right to reject your proposal. If it's for the sake of having a child, I'll cooperate. If not, I have the right to reject, right?" After she finished speaking, he stared into her eyes and said very slowly, "As you wish." He didn't say anything else and got off the bed. When he reached the door, he heaved a sigh of relief. The inexplicable feeling he had just now must have been fake. He might as well not have done it. In the past, when Yuan was too scheming and only wanted to climb into his bed. In his eyes, she was no different from other women. The difference was that he slept with her. Back then, she was his sister-in-law. But now, she didn't want to sleep with him. He still hated her and hated her even more. Yimubai walked back to his bedroom and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, smoking for a long time. He lay down when it was almost dawn, but then he keenly heard the sound of Wen Yuan getting up. He frowned. Why was she in such a hurry to get up? There were some things that she could let the servants at home do. But in the end, he didn't get up, nor did he have any intention of talking to her. The Cold War was probably like this. For the next few days, they spoke very little, almost as if they were strangers in a room. But on the day of a certain international film festival, there was a complete explosion. Yimubai walked the red carpet with the crew. Lin Danny wore a white dress and held Yimubai's arm, silently announcing to the world that this was her man. They even had their fingers tightly intertwined. Yimubai could have rejected it, but he didn't. He didn't know if he was deliberately testing her reaction, so he deliberately let the world see it, and also let her see it. Later, Lin Danny's lipstick mark on the collar of his shirt made him a little confused. He turned his head to look at it. Event in progress, update later, end of this chapter. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.